right. Gentlemen, 20 minutes. My slide. Yeah. Ladies and gentlemen, oi! Ladies and gentlemen, thank you. It looks like despite having some nourishment, instead of putting on some weight, we've lost half of our people. So look, thank you very much for all your attention in the first half. I know that the second half is always where the game's won or lost. Hopefully, as we talk about customers and markets this afternoon, and then having farmers at the centre, we're actually going to win the hearts and minds, not just of the audience that's here today, but of the audience that is online. The express purpose of doing all of this, as we've discussed, is to create the policy, the set of governance structures, the problem statement, to understand how we as farmers should be trading in regen, i.e. trading in carbon and biodiversity. So our next session is about customers and markets. And I'd like to take this opportunity to introduce some really great thinkers on this topic. Today we have as our provocateur Richard Heath from the Australian Farm Institute and Ben van Delden from Deloitte. And I could keep going and tell you all about their wonderful organisations, but instead we've literally eaten into our time. So I'm going to hand over to them to kick off. Thank you.
Thanks, Wardy. Okay, so I'm going to take my role as provocateur seriously, and I'm going to start with what I hope are some pretty provocational questions. And I'm going to say that pretty much everything that we've talked about to this point this morning is pointless, because super large global corporations are the only organisations that have the capacity to change anything in the world at the moment. And so we need to understand what they're doing, what they're incentivizing, what they're investing in, to understand that if we've got any hope of adopting more sustainable farming practice. So there you go. How's that for being provocational? All right. Now, so in understanding, and that's what I mean. So when I'm talking this, my topic is customer's customer. Right, I'm talking about the end of the supply chain. And I'm talking about corporations at the end of the supply chain. So what's the environment that they're being informed by, and what are they getting hammered with every single day and having to address? And it's that question. Is the food system broken? So these are giant global food companies that are getting told all the time that the food system is broken. So I run the Australian Farm Institute. We're an evidence-based policy research organisation. And so we did some research on that question to find out, is the food system broken? And I discovered that indeed the food system is broken. It is not sustainable, it is not equitable, and it is not healthy. The food system is a major contributor to climate change, water pollution, deforestation. It also uses a lot of land, water, and energy. The food system benefits large corporations and wealthy farmers at the expense of small farmers, workers, and consumers. It also contributes to food insecurity and malnutrition. Food system is high in processed foods, sugar, unhealthy fats. It also low in fruits, vegetables, and whole grains. Who agrees with that? Fair few. Right. Now, I said we're an evidence-based organisation. Where do you think we got the evidence for that from? The internet. All of it. That's what happened when I asked HUD, which is one of these flash new AI engines, when I asked it that question. And that's what it came up with. So that is synthesizing everything that is available on the internet through an artificial intelligence engine to ask that question. So that is the weight of evidence. in the world that is informing these companies and placing stakeholder pressure on them every day to do something about it. So what are they doing? We enter into the marvelous world of ESG goals and targets and corporate reporting against ESG. Every single major, sorry, I'm out of the camera. Every single, well, not even major, every single company pretty much in the world these days is now setting ESG goals and targets and reporting against it in annual statements, but particularly the big global agribusinesses. So here's just two, but you could pick any two. And I've just picked Cargill and Nestle because they're enormous. And you can see the sorts of things that they're promising now around regenerative agriculture targets, around deforestation, around just produced sustainably. So Nestle, 100% of key ingredient volumes to be produced sustainably by 2030. Now, you can and you should ask, well, what does that even mean? But, you know, regardless, they're making those sorts of statements. And once that's in an annual report that is released to the market, that starts to impact their share price and their investment attractiveness. And they're essentially compelled to report against that because it's public information that informs whether or not you invest in it or not. So the systems that come about that enable that reporting, the data we've talked about data collection, but the way that's all aggregated up to inform this context as well is becoming really important in terms of how that incentivizes then the other end of the supply chain, which is the farmer. Because there is investment flowing. There's actually really large investment that is starting to flow as a result of these goals and targets that are being set. Who's capturing it and how's it relevant to this discussion? So I'm going to talk about a US example only because I think it's a really elegant solution and an interesting one that I think is doing it particularly well, but it's really relevant to this discussion here today. It's called the Soil and Water Outcomes Fund. It's a joint venture between the Iowa soybean growers and a venture capital fund. And they essentially went to farmers, their members, and said, you know, what can you do that is going to produce a positive biodiversity outcome, cleaner water, sequester carbon? And the farmer said, well, we can do this. And then, and this is a really important bit in terms of the attractiveness to the market, they went and got third party, totally separate, arm's length, not allowed to invest in the fund, method developers and certifiers to develop up methods that could be certified against those practices that farmers said, we can do this. And if we can do this, it would be great if we were paid for it. Then they package those up. Farmers sign up to employ that particular practice, put all the information into a digital platform, so all the data is collected, and then once a year, the Soil and Water Outcomes Fund puts those products into the market at a price that they set. Those are the organisations that they're working with as partners, just a subsample. They've got far more buyers than they've got things to sell. And this is one of the latest announcements that PepsiCo are investing $216 million in that fund along with a couple of others. Now, this is not an offset market. It's a market, but it's not an offset market. It is a market where farmers have recognised that there is investment appetite from these global agribusinesses who need to see sustainability outcomes that they've said in their reports that they're going to produce through their supply chain. And they've gone, oh, hang on, we're the supply chain. We should produce these and they'll pay us for it. And it's starting to happen. And there's two things that are one fundamental thing that's making it happen. And that is the transparency and the confidence that the products that's being utilized around the development of the product that gives someone like PepsiCo confidence to invest in it. Because at the end of the day, coming back to where I started, this is now going to go into their ESG report. It'll be auditable. It'll be subject to all the greenwashing, claims and investigations, and it will go to whether PepsiCo is an attractive, investable company or not. So, is that changing the world? Is that actually producing outcomes that are sustainable or not? I'll leave it to you to work that out, and we'll now move on to Ben.
Thanks, Richard. Always provocative. Thank you for that. I can get these slides up. So I think as we talk about my customer's customer, we need to think about who is ultimately incentivizing these decisions for us to present information about how a product is produced to inform their purchase. And as we have this conversation, we're having it right in the middle of a really challenging economic time. So I thought I'd start by sharing some insights around food frugality. So how willing is a consumer to put sustainability ahead of simply affordability? And I think what's important as we sit here in Australia as a net food exporter, where over 2/3 of our product goes offshore, is to think about not only what does it feel like in our market, but what does it feel like in the markets that we're sending our product to? And they're actually quite different. So looking at our survey, so we survey 23,000 people around 23 countries around the world every month, looking at their consumer preferences. And that would suggest that food frugality is even higher in Australia and South Africa than anywhere else in the world. So what you're sensing when you go to the supermarket here is a little different to what's happening elsewhere around the world. And increasingly, people are starting to make in our market the decision around what to avoid to buy because of an affordability decision. They're coming home with less than they would have otherwise. How do I move this on, Andrew? There we go, got it. So what does that all mean in terms of buying green? Buying green is not going away, though. What we're seeing with this survey data, it actually suggests that 4 in 10 purchasers are still preferring to buy something on a sustainable basis. To Richard's point, the large corporates are driving the message into their products and packaging. But beyond that, we've still got people who are making a choice to buy sustainably for the drivers, the reasons behind the impact that product is having on the market. The attributes that matter most to those consumers are claims around naturally produced, renewable, recycled, or repurposed. They tend to be the key drivers that impact the choice for a consumer. And so you sort of think about that and go, okay, great. Well, if 4 in 10 people are making those purchase decisions, are they really paying a premium? And I think this is the big debate that we often find when we're talking about sustainable food production systems, regenerative agriculture, is the effort I need to put in to change my farming system at the beginning. Am I going to get the reward for it? And the answer is that there's a 27% premium for nearly 50% of those purchase decisions. And when you think about a consumer making a choice for a more sustainable product, the one product they buy most often is food. So it holds that this sector can participate and gain. Now that feels a little bit odd when you think about the fact that we're having this food frugality here in Australia and people are making choices to leave stuff on the shelf and not bring it home. But the answer is there is a premium in it. And the other surprising factor is it's not the consumers that you think. It's not the Gen Y's, Gen Z's. It is the more mature consumer that's making that preferential choice. So, but it doesn't just stop at those ways of production. It also takes into account how a product is produced in terms of its energy efficiency and its packaging. So when you just let that settle for a little bit and you realize this discussion today has been about what's happening on farm, the real challenge is how do we piece it all together and bring the data from the inputs, the farm production systems, the packaging, the processing, the transportation, all the way through to the retail point, because the consumer is considering all of those attributes. Now, coming back to farm, I think one of the big challenges we're facing in this question around my customer's customer and what do they want is, but if no one's asking me precisely for that information, how do I know that it's really needed? And we're seeing this through the advent of the adoption of the science-based target initiatives. So the large retailers and financiers have committed to science-based target initiatives, SBTIs, and that's what's driving the questions back up the supply chain for information about how a product is produced. Richard and I were having a bit of a chat about what drives that consumer's choice. Is it the company? And where do the companies really get their data from? And I was sharing an anecdote about the fourth largest food service provider in the world, and talking to their head of food just last year. And the comment that they made was, if we don't get mind-year-old, we're missing the opportunity to really influence their forward food choices in life. So they're redesigning all their store formats to reach that person who yet can't drive a car. So you have to think about, how do you reach that consumer? So we're dealing with businesses that see that logic, that you have to get inside the head of that mid-teen to work out what their future purchase decisions are going to be as they move forward. So there is a big role, I think, for corporates. Sorry, that wasn't as provocative as we'd hoped, because I actually agree that there's a key role there, as Richard points out. But to be provocative, I would say that's because the Australian food system is actually broken. I agree with that, Richard, because there's a void. We don't actually have a system. A system implies it's integrated. Ours is not. We have an agriculture system and then an everything else that happens afterwards system. And those two things are connected. If we are to reach net zero, if we're to try and produce a product that is nature positive, we need to have the systems that help bring the data together all the way to the consumer. But we need to have a system that brings the leadership together to make the right decisions to get those outcomes. And when we do that, we can solve for who funds where the effort falls greatest. And the effort falls greatest up the supply chain at the farm point. That is our big challenge. So I think there is a role for large agri-food corporates, mainly because we haven't set the system correctly in Australia. We don't have an integrated ag and food system, and that is quite different to other parts of the world. So, Richard, if we could continue that thread. Yeah, you've looked at lots of different food systems around the world, and you've seen the food companies like the Nestle's and the Cargills operating everywhere. Given the challenges that we've been talking about today, what do you see as better examples of a connected food system we're currently enduring?
So I think you really nailed it there with your last point. Now, I've been to these sorts of conferences in the US, and you've got the same people in the room that you have now, but you've also got Nestle and Unilever and PepsiCo. It is integrated there. Now, I don't know what we've done here. I don't know what the cultural barriers are in Australia that have, and all the ag conferences I go to in Australia, just having this conversation just recently at another one that I was at. It is so rare that you go to anything in Australia that truly has the food system from beginning to end represented within it. And that's something that we really need to fix.
I agree. I think there's lots of competition at the beginning, but not much competition at the end. And so consequently, as the funnel gets narrower, the conversations, there's less people involved in them. And that is something that we have to change as well. If you looked at a European market where there's lots of different channels for a product to flow through in the retail community, it's much narrower here in Australia. So you have a lot more influence by few as a consequence.
Because what we do have, and this is not meant to be disparaging in any way, because the Feather and Bones and the organisations like that, which are an incredibly important part of the food system, but the reality is it's a very small percentage of the product that we're producing. It's super important in terms of setting targets, setting goals, seeing what the ambition is, seeing what we should be striving towards. But it's never going to be more than low single figures percentage-wise in terms of our total consumption. It's just not the way the economy is ever going to work. It's always going to be that super premium end. So, I think as farmers, again, when we talk about the customer's customer and understanding who that is, a lot of the time we will get those people thinking that the customer's customer is the person putting their hand in the pocket in the supermarket or in a butcher or wherever that is actually paying the money. But the customer's customer that has the most ability to produce change at scale is not the person putting their hand in the wallet.
Yeah. And, the difference between those two types of customer, feather and bone customer, where there's that intimate relationship, and the customer that might be receiving the product in another geography, another hemisphere, as they have to trust the system as opposed to trust the supplier, is a different relationship. I think nutritional labeling is a really good example of how government has regulated and industry has risen to a standard in terms of how do we communicate about the quality, the nutritional quality of food. The question that I think is on the minds of many governments now is, okay, well, if industry has met and in many cases exceeded that bar, like there's very limited examples of having to hold someone to account for not presenting the right nutritional data. Where does government now put its energy? And if we were having this conversation in Denmark or the Netherlands, the answer would be in climate labeling. So if Richard and I both produce a can of baked beans and Andrew's the customer, how do we help Andrew make the choice between our two products based on the net impact that those products have? Right now, if you go into a supermarket in Europe, you'll see a litre of milk in a carton, and 3 of the 4 sides are used to tell the story about all the different sorts of things that they're doing around biodiversity and water use and packaging and sustainable production systems and energy choices. So unless we start inventing 6-sided cartons, we really need to try and unify our climate impact reporting frameworks. And I think this is, again, where the big companies have to play a role because they are selling through all states, all geographies, and they want consistency.
So the other hemispheres bit you just brought up too, I think it's just worth finishing on noting also that when customer's customer in the Australian context, we're an exporting nation and we think about who we're exporting to. In this discussion, a lot of the time, the focus obviously goes to premium markets like Europe. The reality is we do most of our stuff into Asia, and then you get detractors saying Asia doesn't care. Now, Murray Watt's just come back from India, so you'll hear him. It's his favourite figure now. You've heard him use it in 2 forums since he's got back. There's more 17-year-olds in India than there is the population of Australia. The average age of many Asian countries is in its 20s.
Yep.
So yes, the wealth might be lower, but the age of the population is so much younger, and young people are interested in sustainability, and that is a universal truth. So, thinking that our big export markets are not going to be interested in this stuff, I think is a danger as well. And I think we should be really conscious of that being, super informing into what our customers are going to need as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the other discussion that you brought up as well was around the important role of offsets, and where does the consumer fall on that question about how do we get to actually net zero? Yeah, the work we've done with consumers would suggest that offsetting is not the preferred path. They would actually rather see a business clean up its internal supply chain and work with its partners to drive down the impact on the environment. So insetting is the preferred choice for the consumer, which is the stories that we're hearing being talked about today. Have we got the incentives right in our current financial markets to reward those that are putting effort into insetting? What could we do there, do you think, that needs to sort of spruik that working together to clean up the supply chain? Any thoughts?
I think we've got a lot to do, because as soon as you start talking about insetting, you're talking about things that are happening within a supply chain, and then immediately the greenwashing and the corporate profiteering issues come into that, and the skepticism and the worry about that. So, it does come back to just the legitimacy of the products that are being produced, and the ability of those products to be verified, traced, well-credentialed, evidence provided, so that when those sorts of claims do come up, they can be countered with evidence, essentially. It's the only way we can get around that.
Yeah. And
Yep.
done. Perfect.
Thank you. That was amazing. My customer section. Thanks, Richard. Thanks, Ben. That was awesome. I could have kept going with that. Just while standing on the sides, I got to notice that there's very few people over here. Half our audience is over, or more than half our audience is on this side. I'm not sure whether that makes you right-brained or left-brained people, whether you're close to the door, lazy people. Excellent. All right. Look, there isn't an Australian farmer that doesn't have a mortgage. And if we're going to talk about customers and markets, we need to talk about banks. So I'd like to bring Carmel Onions and James Campbell to continue the provocateur responder format and talk about lender and farmer risk. So I think you're the provocateur, Carmel.
Hi, everyone. I'm Carmel Onions. I work at Commonwealth Bank, and I lead our work in sustainability in support of our agribusiness and working with our farmers. So in terms of farmer and lending risk, a lot of what we'll be talking about today is ESG risk, so environment, social and governance risk, and particularly the E on the environmental side. But just to get straight into it, I'd just like to kick off with 4 things that CBA really understands and holds true around environmental risk, which really underpins what we're doing in sustainability. The first is that the health of natural capital impacts the productivity, profitability, and resilience of farmers. Now, to all of us in the room, that's pretty obvious, I'm sure, but I don't know that it is necessarily held as closely as we're holding it in this room more broadly. So important, the more we can do to optimise the function of the landscape, to maximise the inputs of moisture and nutrients at the lowest cost to the farmer across the weather cycle, the better. The second thing I'd like to identify is, of course, the world has set a target to be net carbon zero by 2050 and has interim targets. And the conversation before now was just really useful because not only supply chains, but certainly banks are committing to these targets too. And they're going to be supporting farmers on that journey to net carbon zero along with supply chains. The key point is that banks and supply chains will be committing to Scope 3 targets. And so, as was pointed out in the session before, they do become legally binding targets on those organisations when they have been committed to publicly. So what is clear is that the journey to net carbon zero needs to be undertaken. The third thing I'd call out is that, of course, environmental markets are developing and the carbon market in particular is firing in Australia. These markets are important because they're incentivising and rewarding customers, farmers, to make the changes that are desirable. And so the focus now, as we understand the extent of degradation around biodiversity and also the importance of biodiversity to our ecosystems, is that a lot of attention is now turning to those markets as well. And then to close the loop on these things, of course, carbon and biodiversity are key to natural capital health, which is where I started in these 4 things. and really underpins that profitability and resilience story. CBA is here today because we understand these things, and we've been very actively preparing for this over several years now to support farmers as they're preparing for these challenges. So what does that look like? The key thing we've done is developed a it's called the CBA Agri Green Loan. It's the first of a number of innovative solutions that we've developed and come up with to support farmers in these endeavours around decreasing their net emissions and increasing and improving their resilience and natural capital health. So the CBA Agri Green Loan is like a standard loan, except it's heavily discounted finance, and it's only eligible for purposes that we know reduce gross emissions, help you sequester more carbon into your natural capital, and other purposes that improve natural capital as well. So for example, pollution, waterways, biodiversity, and so on. The next thing we have really focused on is our commitment to supporting the carbon market. We know that these environmental markets are going to be very important in the transition. And so CBA has really gotten actively behind it. We've got an established carbon trading desk and a whole range of solutions to help farmers already. This particular deal was another example of a first to market innovation, which we're really striving to be creative and help solve some of these hurdles around finance, and also, again, to help encourage action. So in this example, CBA prepaid some carbon credits upfront, which was very attractive to a lot of people that we talk to, and allows them to sort of monetize that future income upfront. We also help farmers trade in the spot market. We can offer some forward contracts and some price risk management solutions, and so on. So again, really sort of actively engaging in these markets. And as you can imagine, we have been focused on developing a whole range of sustainable finance products more collectively, because sustainable finance is, again, just another mechanism that a bank can use to try and encourage a conversation around what a farmer's doing to improve their natural capital and to get to net carbon zero. So we've got sustainable home loans, sustainable asset finance, a whole range of things. So really that work to prepare for that. So when it comes to what the banks look for in all of this, of course, the sustainable finance is very specific for the purpose. But more generally, banks are looking at the risks that the farming property itself and the business management of it, whether it will or won't deliver the cash flows that the bank is relying on when they're lending you money. So important is for the bank to understand your business strategy. And in farming, of course, natural capital is going to be a big chapter in that strategy. So a really key point is to engage with your banker and really share the strategy that you're pursuing around your natural capital. For example, if you're in a position of transitioning, you might actually need some financial support to get through any sort of productivity dips while you're sort of transitioning, as an example. So I'm going to leave it there and welcome James to the conversation.
Oh, okay. Hi, everyone. Hand up if you're a producer. Hand up if you've got a bank loan. There's your most important partner, the bank. You got to stand up, Carmel. So I'm not going to present anything here, but what I want to do is I want to take this back to the farm gate. So what we've spoken about today, and I think it's been brilliant, it really has, is what this really means for the farmer. So let's talk about an insetting opportunity, an ERF opportunity, a biodiversity opportunity. I'm sitting on my place, and I've come across these as options. I've got hold of Regen Farmers Mutual. I'm a paid up member. I've had an assessment on my place, and it looks like there's something there. You know, there's an opportunity to potentially inset emissions. I could do an ERF, call it an environmental plantings, and there's a biodiversity opportunity too. I then go and pull out full CAN, which is the full carbon accounting model, because someone nice showed me how to do it. And I'm starting to put some numbers around what I could produce per hectare over a 25-year period, assuming that's my permanence, etc. And then I think, okay, well, it's going to potentially cost me this, and I've got to lock up that much country or sacrifice that much country, and that's going to do that to my production. And then I think, well, this all looks pretty good. Oh, I need to get eligible interest holder consent. In actual fact, I actually need to ask the bank if I can do any of this stuff, because they're my most important partner, but they also have a mortgage over all my assets, and I really can't do much to affect the value of that asset or alter my income production strategy without their support. What's my next steps?
Well, speak to the bank early. These aren't simple conversations that you can just sort of knock off over half an hour over the kitchen table. It's going to be a process that I really encourage you to engage with the bank early on, because we want to understand your strategy. We want to buy into it. We want to be your business partner, and we want to support you through it. We really want to understand what you're trying to achieve, the initiatives that you're putting in place, who you're working with. Like, we're really interested to make sure that you're not taking on counterparty risk. You're not working. This is the expression is, there's a lot of snake oil merchants out there. This is a new market, and there's some excellent organisations as well. So we'll be thinking about who you're working with, what is the project, and what is that going to do to the cash flows that you've already committed to the bank. So where carbon projects complement the agricultural enterprise, that's just a win-win for you and the bank, because you're uplifting the natural capital, potentially earning that diversified income and continuing to operate as you were. If you need to modify those cash flows, again, it's just important for the bank to understand that and potentially support you through that transition process. So once we understand the strategy, then it's just a matter of collecting documentations. I mean, it does effectively treasure a credit review. So we do just need to make sure that the cash flows that we're relying on will continue to turn up. And so we'll understand the contracts that you're signing up to, the forecast carbon income, if you're indeed wanting to utilise some of that carbon income in your credit assessment. And generally, as I just said, make sure that we understand the project as well as you do.
Okay. You mentioned Scope 3 emissions before. I just want to clarify something that I think is correct. My understanding, and this was a little chat we had earlier, was that the bank counts in its Scope 3 emissions those of its customers. Is that correct?
Yep.
Okay. So it would be in the bank's interest that its farm gate book reduces their emissions, which thus reduces the Scope 3 emissions of the bank, which then comes to those ESG guidelines and principles and promises that are in glossy in the bank's annual report, right?
Yes.
Right. Really interesting, right? So we've got the federal government committing us to net emissions reductions by 2030 and 2050. We've got farmers being labelled, I think I read in the Financial Review last week, the week before, possibly the week before, The Economist, The Guardian. Most publications are talking about farmers doing a lot of the heavy lifting around sequestering carbon, because on land is where you sequester carbon. What's the bank talking about internally? Because as a big bank with a big farm gate book, as CBA does, and I would say that there's been a, certainly from where I sit, there's been a bit of a market leading approach from CBA, particularly with your carbon markets desk. do you see a rushing of the fences, so to speak, which ultimately will assist you in terms of those scope 3s and obviously potentially even increase your book because you would be potentially winning new business. But then on the other hand, you've got to go and do a case by case basis of all of your customers because no two customers are the same. So how do you set yourself up from an infrastructure perspective to essentially provide eligible interest holder consents, really underpin what a lot of producers are seeing as opportunities, which I outlined before, that ultimately are going to go to your advantage. But there's so much wood to chop, Carmel.
Yeah, and that's about 7 questions in one. Thanks, James.
Go for it.
So just to recap, I think at last count, 6 Australian banks, including all of the majors, have committed to the Net Zero Banking Alliance, which means that they are indeed committed to net carbon zero on scope 3 emissions by 2050. And so for us as a bank, scope 3 emissions is the emissions that we finance. So if we finance half of your balance sheet, we'll count half of your emissions. And so progressively, the banks are working through all of their portfolios. So we've started obviously with coal and oil and gas, the really high emitting sectors, and set emissions reductions targets for our financed emissions, as are all of the banks. Now, agriculture is critically important and there's no substitute for food. So it's not like coal, where there is a potential substitute being renewable energy and you can potentially debank. Agriculture is very different. And so it becomes much more of a partnership to support farmers on the journey. And that's a really important point because people can get quite anxious about the fact that banks and whoever else supply chains are setting these scope 3 emissions reductions targets. We can't just stop producing food. We have to help farmers with education, with the tools, with the extension, work in partnership with other organisations to help farmers make plans that work for their family farming businesses to get towards net carbon zero. Trying to remember all the questions you asked.
Go again. So just setting yourself up from an infrastructure perspective. So the way a bank works, relationship manager in generally a regional area, if not metro area and travels, might have 20 to 50, farm gate customers, say. With what's coming their way, there's a requirement to not only upskill in terms of understanding or continuing to develop the understanding of natural capital opportunities, but also being able to front their customer on a relatively fluid topic with conviction. Is there training? Is there how are you? How is CBA adapting this to their team and enabling their team just that step ahead?
Yeah, thank you for the reminder. So it's a really good question because CBA, like the others, are large banks. We have large workforces and they're all very disaggregated around the country. All of our bankers live and work in regional communities. So there's 2 ways that we're addressing this. The first is we have a specialist team that supports transactions, particularly around carbon farming, for example. So all of these transactions come into a specialist team in CBA. We can put our specialists in front of clients for farmers with our bankers to have a specialist conversation, but we also have dedicated credit risk team and myself oversees, as part of my sustainability work, all of these transactions. So we can ensure that we get them through quickly and that they're dealt with people that understand the market and won't just sort of say no because they don't really understand it. It's all too hard. Separately, as you can imagine, because our bankers are farmers, many of them themselves, and do have family farming businesses that they're a part of, they're on a journey as well. And so we're doing a lot of work with them, not only to understand the thematics around getting to net carbon zero and improving natural capital, but also what are the options? So we understand the problem. but what are some of the options available to farmers? But the main thing is just that we're increasingly having a conversation. We're not just sort of rushing out there. Can you give us the financials? How much you're going to produce this year? We actually want to understand more broadly your strategic goals around your sustainability plans.
Yeah, and yeah, thanks for that. Well answered. And I think what probably follows that infrastructure build may even be, product build. So, if you look at something like an ERF project, Carmel, where there's, it's a bit like a project finance where you front up, you put the project in, and then income comes later. So, do you see there potentially being, fit for purpose products that are structured not just by, flicking it under the existing mortgage and cash flows, but actually saying, okay, well, we'll defer interest here or capitalize interest there, and then as the revenues start, that becomes it's a separate facility, so to speak, to the farm loan. Are we there yet?
Well, I mean, there's some of the examples that I've been sort of sharing in my introduction. Certainly there's one still up on the screen. We're very open to innovation. So it's not just what we come up with, but also, hearing from the market what they need and what they're looking for. It's just such a new space, and the bank's very keen to participate and support. So I don't think really anything's off the table other than just a really considered approach to managing these new risks around these new markets, and just making sure that, the principles of responsible lending are upheld and that we protect our farmers.
Well done. I think we're at the wind up there. So thank you.
Sure. I best ask Carmel.
I was just having this conversation at lunch, and I personally think that there's some work to be done to kind of clarify what it means for your baseline emissions when a carbon project's in play. And so I defer to the people that look after those frameworks. And we'd be guided by those. That's really a bit of a non-answer. But yeah, I mean, if you're confused, I think many other people are, and there's certainly a gap to be closed around that question. One thing I would say is I think the majority of Scope 3 reporting is on the basis of gross emissions. So that sort of takes some of the questions out as well. So yeah, probably not the expert to answer that question.
We actually have the solicitor and the barrister coming on in the next section, farmers at the centre, and some of those questions, Cam, will be addressed. So we're going to keep going with customers and markets, and I just have to do a shout out to Larissa Taylor, who was in our program up until I think over the weekend, when she got called up for jury duty and wasn't able to fly over from Western Australia to be with us today. And so Larissa is replaced by our very own Rowan Clark today. You're actually going to see, Larissa Clark today, and Tim King. They're going to talk about financial sustainability reporting, and then Tim's going to depart the stage. Rowan's going to stick around, and then you're going to join with Rowan. So you get 40 minutes of Rowan and Tim and Rowan and Bjorn. Without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to you, Tim.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Wardy. And we've had to improvise a bit, so we've inverted. And it's nice to be here, and finally financial reporting actually becomes a little bit more interesting. So hopefully, so I co-founded Melia Investment Management 5 years ago. We're an ESG fund with a difference in that we're an impact fund, which is kind of at the frontier of ESG investing. In other words, our clients not only want to invest in a genuine, authentic way, avoid greenwashing, and not just not investing in industries causing harm, like gaming, for example, but actually want to invest in companies that are actually trying to provide solutions to the enormous social, environmental problems that we face. So that's my background. Quick intro, right? At the end. So the way we're going to do, I've just got 3 slides just to set the scene, and then we're going to have a Q&A. So I think there's plenty of provocative stuff to talk about here. So it's not an exaggeration to say that we have a seismic shift in financial reporting standards that are coming down the track. Basically, accounting was invented 100 years ago, and it hasn't changed for 100 years. So the top bit is what we have at the moment. So we have, sorry, there's lots of acronyms in this space. So we have IASB, which is the International Accounting Standards Board, and that governs IFRS accounting standards, and that's how companies around the world report today. So we have a P&L, and we have a balance sheet, and we have a cash flow statement. And that's it. It's pretty simple. It hasn't changed in 100 years, basically. And there is no regard whatsoever for externalities in that accounting, right? So what happened at the Glasgow COP a couple of years ago is IASB launched ISSB, so the International Sustainability Standards Board. So this new IFRS is rolling out a whole new suite of ESG reporting standards for companies. And this is going to happen very soon in Australia. Going to have profound impacts on the way companies report and profound impacts on capital flows in the whole financial system. Why has this happened? Well, it's happened for lots of reasons. We heard that just then the banks are worried about ESG risk in their loan book. We're investors. We're worried about ESG risk in the companies we invest in. We have absolutely no way of actually understanding that risk in a consistent way. We have sustainability reports from companies. They're not audited. They have pictures of beautiful things happening in those companies, and the companies cherry pick the data. And we've kind of got to guess what the ESG risk are in companies. So what this does is actually give us a consistent methodology for companies reporting on their ESG data and risks. So this is a really profound shift in the way companies report. Where are we at? Well, so ISSB has released 2 standards, and we're at in the bits in yellow. So they've released a climate standard, it's called S2, and they've released a generic standard called S1. And S1 is a placeholder for companies to report on their material ESG risks. And then through time, they're going to release a whole new set of standards, which I've outlined in red there. So they've talked, there's going to be a biodiversity standard, there's going to be a human capital standard. So companies are going to have to report on all these additional ESG metrics. This is really complex, really resource intense. And even the largest companies I talk to are really struggling of how they're going to do this. They don't have the data, they don't have the systems, they don't have the people. So it's a really complex set of work that's coming down the line. So what's this going to require? Well, it's going to require governance controls. In other words, these are designed to be auditable, and directors are going to have to sign off on these set of accounts, right? Now, if I'm a director signing off on a set of nature accounts, I'm going to have some surety that the science behind those nature accounts are accurate. How are we going to do that? There's going to be risks and opportunities that flow from that. And then ultimately how those risks and opportunities are going to be managed, and out of that, we get metrics and targets. So what we're going to see, like we've seen with the, well before the safeguard mechanism, we've had large corporates committing to net zero. We're going to have corporates committing to nature positive, whatever that means, right? So we're going to have these, before this is mandated, we're going to have companies moving on this quite quickly, I think. What's the Australian government said? Well, we've had Treasury has called for 2 submissions this year in terms of how these new set of accounting standards, what we should adopt. The feedback has been it should universally follow the ISSB standards. And what they're talking and what the proposal is that the standards will be rolled out progressively by size of company, but they're talking about companies with more than $50 million of turnover and 100 employees. This will be mandatory by the year 27, 28. That's 4 years' time, right? Now, unless you're BHP or a large corporate, how do you do that, right? So if you look at the climate standard, for example, not only reporting on scope 3 emissions, but scope 3 physical and transition risk, right? You need a climate model to do that. Who's going to do that work? That's expensive. That requires time, system. It's extremely complicated. So I think for smaller companies, this is going to be really challenging and difficult. And to come back to the earlier point, if you're supplying to Nestle, Nestle's got its own targets. You're going to be required to do this to be a supplier, right? So something to think about. And finally, just before I hand over to Rowan asking the difficult questions, we're way behind, right? The EU's already done this. They launched it 2 weeks ago. There's a whole new set of ESG reporting standards have come out based on ISSB. So we're behind the times as usual, but you can see where the world's going. We're going to be following Europe. So over to you, Rowan.
Thanks, Tim. We were having a giggle before about the number of acronyms that exist in this space.
Well, I try to make it easy.
So if I understand it correctly, we're on the verge of having an effective mechanism to price in these externalities that we've been, haven't been taken into account up until now. So we have governments who set, I'm going to simplify it down, governments set targets. Oh, yeah, we're both in there. That's, you can see it's the governments who set targets. And then we have multinational organisations who come in and set frameworks. So that's the SBTI, the Science Based Target Initiatives, and the TNFD, and the Task Force for Nature-related Disclosures. Then underneath that, you get the accounting bodies who take those frameworks and turn them into standards, or other organisations like the GRI, who are, create the Global Reporting Initiative standards. And then underneath those standards, we have companies who are reporting against those standards. So we've now got companies who are going to be reporting against IFRS 1 and 2. And then underneath those companies, you have supply chains. And then right down the bottom, you've got this farmer who's supplying into the farm chain, that supply chain. And that farmer's going to need to provide the data that underpins the company's reporting that flows right up. So the idea is that everyone's going to be held accountable under this kind of metric, and perhaps we're on the cusp of being able to do that. But realistically, as you said, it's a complex and difficult, and the number of acronyms just suggests how difficult it is. How ready are the investor market, if you like, for being able to assess and really, as Richard Heath was pointing out, we expect share prices of companies to be reflected by their performance. How ready is the investor market, do you think, the institutional investor market, for kind of assessing a company's kind of relative performance from a ESG perspective?
I think the investor market is relatively, I use that word cautiously, relatively well prepared. It's the, because we know this is coming, right? But it's the companies are going to have to report on this. And as I said, in we invest in companies from, the largest companies down, right? And it's a very non-linear curve. So you've got the large listed companies have got the resources and systems and data to somewhat do this. And, climate reporting is, in my opinion, CCFD is way easier than TNFD. It's a whole new dimension of complexity reporting under TNFD, because there isn't one unit of nature, obviously. So, beyond those large listed companies with having the resources and expertise and data, and that's far from complete, right? It falls off a cliff. If you're a company below that I've never had to do this before, never had to think about it, don't have any of those things in place, this is deeply problematic, right? So I think there's potentially a bit of a train wreck here, because I see the ag sector, I see a significant opportunity, but I see significant risk. So there's not many listed ag companies, right? When I talk to nature risk to those companies, they really can't answer my questions, right? Because they simply don't have the science and data and the systems behind it. That's a real issue. So I think there's a real capital attraction problem looming for companies who can't do this. there's certainly significant reputational risk. There is a view out there that nature litigation will just completely dwarf climate litigation, right? We've heard before that consumers are demanding this. Unless you can provide this data, you can't satisfy those consumers. There's a real risk about, there's an increasing risk about attracting new employees because people don't want to work for companies that are trashing the environment, right? And obviously there's regulatory risk as well. So I think the risk is far more on the company side, but as we've said, that they're just going to push that through their supply chain because in order for them to report, their suppliers need to report. I think the supply chain one is where the system starts falling apart from what I can see. Because if you're a small provider, how do you do all this stuff? It's super complicated.
Absolutely. We're seeing this at the point of failure for the data supply chain, if you like, is once you've got the bag of potatoes, once you've got the potatoes in the bag and there's a barcode, you can track it. You can track where it's gone and how many units of carbon have been created shipping that bag of potatoes around the country. But it's like, what happened on farm to create that bag of potatoes? And that's where the data needs to be captured. It needs to be captured on farm and shared up to the supply chain. And that is the break in the chain. And that's why engaging farmers in effective ways to actually enable them to share the data that goes to prove their environmental claims, that support the environmental claims of their customers is fundamental.
Yeah. So it flows through this. It's a systems problem.
So, well, which was that point that Ben was making around that in Australia we've got a bit of a pointy top end of the supply chain, and so there's a bit of a market imbalance. How are you seeing the markets respond in putting pressure on the large retailers, the buyers? Is it the same? Are the same mechanisms at play as there are in the agri-foods kind of sector?
On the supermarkets?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, so just to be clear, we don't invest in any of these companies, right? For a whole bunch of different reasons, but we still talk to them. So, if you speak to one of those, Woolworths or Coles, what are they worried about? They're worried about modern slavery is a huge one for them. That's in this. I think the thing, this isn't just about climate and nature. It's emissions. It's modern slavery, it's nature, it's safety, it's cyber, it's equal pay. I mean, it's just like, this is something that sort of ESG was something that sat on the side. No one really paid attention to it 5 years ago. And now it's front and center. And what we've seen is when things like Duke and Gorge go wrong, that's an ESG risk. I would argue that if Duke and Gorge had happened, 10 years ago, the executives of Rio Tinto probably would still have their jobs. And, that's sort of when ESG risk goes bad, it has manifest implications on companies, right? We've seen it with Crown and Star and AMP. And so this is something companies are really worried about, right? And the supermarkets face the complete storm of these ESG risks. There's a lot of risk in the system, and they're really worried about that for all the reasons I just described, right? Because all the stakeholders are putting pressure on them. So, but it depends on what the company does as terms of what their exposures are.
Absolutely, absolutely. So, we've seen this in the carbon market and in other markets as well. But how then do the corporates avoid that greenwashing? We talked about verified certification credentials this morning. Like, what are the ways that the investor market can kind of look to get the confidence that the corporates aren't saying one thing and
TNFD, well, ISSD. So at the moment, that's going to help us a lot, because at the moment, as I said before, companies, nothing's auditable, right? And they can say what they want. And I really focus on net zero targets, which usually use offsets. They don't tell you where the offsets are coming from. I then go back to the companies and say, oh, can you tell me the source of the offsets? Often it's some chunky offset that, my research tells me that it's hard to say this is really additional, that, someone's just ripping off the system. But the problem is I go back to the companies and said, you're using rubbish offsets, right, in your net zero claims, but it's not because they're being malicious. They don't actually know, right? They have no idea what they've bought. They said, well, we just bought it off this broker.
So
And I said, that's not good enough, right? So
this wouldn't address that though, would they?
well, no, this will, well, no, it won't address that particular, that's another problem. We can get to that in a second, but this will at least address what the starting point is.
Right.
Because it has to be, I think that once state directors have to sign off on statements and they're auditable, that focus minds, right?
Yep.
Because if I'm a director, I don't particularly want to go to jail. So I want to make, at the moment, that's not the case, right? So we at least we'll know what the starting point is. I think this whole issue of offsettings, if you look at the SBTI standards, offsetting, yeah, there's a role for offsetting, but that's on the emissions that can't be abated. And there'll be a role for nature crediting, offsetting. I think we've got to be careful what verb we use there. But I just think there's going to be a lot more focus on whether those offsets are authentic, whether they're additional, and the governance of the offsetting too. Where is the money actually going back to the people they say the money's going back to? So that's a minefield.
Yeah,
And I think it's mainly because it's just really badly understood. So
it's great how like this conversation today has taken us through a journey that there's a convergence happening. We've talked about certification and the data verification and the need to and the convergence around quite, the expected possible potential prospective convergence of certification, because there's a myriad of lick your own ice cream kind of solutions out there at the moment.
yeah,
But so you've got certification as the way to potentially kind of address, get some credibility for a corporate to be able to kind of go, right, this is a claim that's been verified by a third party. Are you seeing like how this supply chain offset, environmental markets, this convergence, are you seeing how that's kind of playing out in investors' minds? That
you mean bringing nature into it?
yeah, well, so you just spoke about like offsets have been till now, effectively regulatory offsets. They've been required, 95% of our markets being the ERF buying.
Yes.
Yep. 5%'s been voluntary, and of that 5%, 95% was bought offshore. So they were going for the cheapest. And so that market's subject to change.
Yep.
And so, yeah, well, it's wondering, but what we're seeing is that like the idea of an offset that's unrelated to your industry is losing favor, that like supply chains are looking to inset because that makes more sense. And so I guess my question was, are you seeing like this idea of a convergence between environmental markets and this offsetting kind of concept and what companies are doing with supply chains?
I'm not, right? I'm not that close to it. I mean, obviously it's important. I'm investing in companies. I would just say there's just massive skepticism and uncertainty and confusion about offsetting, crediting, nature of it, what does all this mean? And I think there's been examples, as I've said before, where there's been actually honest players thinking they're right, buying an offset, and it turns out to be a rubbish offset, and they don't even know, right? Because it's just so opaque and confusing. They buy a Vera standard offset. That Vera standard offset maybe isn't, we've seen four corners, right? And so I just think there's massive skepticism, and so there should be. So there's a huge problem there, right? Because offsetting has to be part of the solution. But we're, where we're at now is it's just really confusing and a lot of skepticism.
I got one more question then, just to bring it back to the farmers, because there's a conversation that crops up as to who pays or who pays first. I mean, ultimately we all pay. But do you have any thoughts on the kind of the way this kind of rolls out? Do the retailers take a hit on their margins in paying more to the farmers to incentivize actions, or are farmers expected to wear it on the chin?
We heard that, a small segment of consumers probably will help pay, right? But that's not going to pay for it. I just think the problems are so complex and so many resources are going to be required that the large supermarkets, for example, are going to have to work with their suppliers and help them and share knowledge, right? Because otherwise they're not going to have any suppliers, right, to meet. So I don't really know, but it's the only way I really see it moving forward, because unless you're a large supermarket, you're not going to have the resources and technical skill to do the stuff. So it's going to be working with them, I think, and sharing the burden. So that would be my guess.
So Ben, wherever you are, we need to engage those large supermarkets. Thanks, thanks, Woody.
Thanks, Ron. Stay on stage, Tim.
Thanks.
Thanks, Woody.
Okay, so I'm going to try and get you out in time for smoko at the right time. How's that? And then you can actually, unlike lunch, have a decent amount of time to talk. Bjorn, can I invite you up on stage? And today, Bjorn and Rowan are going to tackle the topic of who do we sell to? Over to you, gents. That little arrow will bring you to your slide.
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Björn Everts. I'm the head of offset solutions, carbon solutions at Tasman Environmental Markets. So I'm not a thought leader or a global expert, but I've got some insight into what's happening in the carbon market at the moment. My role centers on facilitating large, long-term investments in the carbon market. Working directly with safeguard affected organizations and large buyers in the voluntary space. Just a bit of background on TEM as an organization. So we were established in 2014. The Tasman part doesn't actually refer to Tasmania, it refers to the Tasman Sea, because we have offices in Auckland and offices across Australia as well. We're a mixed or integrated carbon business. So we do everything from developing our own carbon projects across Australia in the Asia Pacific region through to large-scale brokering, very relationship-focused brokering of really high integrity, high quality carbon offsets. We've built a business on quality, and the previous speaker very clearly outlined that one of the big problems is, the company's gone out, they've bought these offsets, they did so in good faith, thinking that they were doing the right thing, and then a watchdog or a regulator finds them out and they get dragged through the coals, and then they come to us and they say, we need high quality and we're willing to pay for it. We're not the cheapest, but we do a huge amount of due diligence to make sure that we get the highest quality offsets. And if they're not available in the market, then we set up the project ourselves where we can. This slide just gives you a bit of insight into what large companies are looking for when they come to us. So they want price security. These big companies are starting to, they're starting to employ carbon experts. They understand that the price of carbon, they read the EY reports, they understand that the price of carbon is going to steadily increase. They want to lock down large volumes for really long periods of time. We're having requests now for 15-year forward offtakes on high volume transactions. They want availability of the supply. They want to make sure that when they're locking into a contract for 500,000 or 1 million credits, that the supply is actually gonna come through when they need it, and then they're not going to be left in the lurch for these really high volume trades. And then due diligence. So some of these companies are paying $1 million a pop for external consultants to just do the due diligence on carbon offsets purchases. There's so much opacity out in the market. There's so much skepticism. Our customers are becoming increasingly sophisticated. They're starting to employ in-house. They're setting up carbon trading desks. They're employing internal experts. They're getting really smart about, and they want to know every single detail of the carbon project. So that's where we have to, in some cases, we have to form exclusive partnerships with our carbon suppliers. We need to do on-site visits. We need to take people onto site to provide that level of assurance and security. And then a lot of what we do, like a lot of people forget that carbon offsets, it's a reputational product. So much of it is based on the story and the brand and the trust that you've created as an organization or as an intermediary or as a carbon seller. And that's really relevant to this room as well. If you can build trust as a farmer, as an intermediary, you can command a premium, and you can command you can ask for a long-term offtake agreement. This just gives you an idea of the clients that we work with. So we're most known for when you offset with Qantas or Singapore Airlines. when you tick the box, the offset box, we do the calculations, we do the offsetting, we source the offsetting, we source the carbon credits. We construct portfolios for organizations ranging everywhere from, you know, really expensive, really high quality Australian carbon credit units through to Chinese and Indian wind, provided they're high quality. These organizations are the organizations that I can speak to with some kind of assurance and qualification, because they're the ones we deal with. I can't really make any kind of bold statements about the carbon market, but I can tell you what I'm seeing with these organizations.
Thanks, Bjorn. So I'm clearly going to be coming from the farmer perspective again, because that's my role. But the one of the things that when I was first starting out in financial markets a long time ago, one of my mentors or old bloke said to me was like, supply always configures itself to meet demand, right? So, you know, it's another way of saying, you know, show me the incentive and I'll show you the outcome. And one of the questions we have is, you know, from a Regen farmer's perspective, from a farmer perspective, is what is the demand? What is it that we need to do to kind of to best meet the needs of buyers, whether they're environmental markets or supply chains? And so from that perspective, what do you, if we talk to the key barriers or the things that you look for, how do we go about addressing this kind of mismatch between, we've got, you know, 150,000 farmers in the country, but, you know, only a handful of buyers kind of thing? What are the ways we can go about, you know, creating the scale to kind of manage that?
Sure, it's a really good question. The immediate one is aggregation. So our big corporate buyers, you know, the minimum kind of deal they'll do is 30,000 Australian carbon credit units for one spot trade, or, you know, per year for a multi-year contract. There are some amazing, super high quality carbon projects in Australia. There's some really dodgy ones, but there's also some incredible ones, but they tend to be small. That focus on quality and care that goes into them means they're often 5,000, 10,000, maybe 20,000 if you're lucky. There's some unicorns like the Arnhem Land fire abatement projects that do, you know, 500,000, 600,000 a year, and they're exceptional, but they're really, really rare. So being able to pull together a whole lot of really small, high quality carbon projects and build a brand around it, because the problem is now, you know, customers are getting so sophisticated. They really want to dive deep. They want to go and visit the farms, basically. They want to shake hands with the farmers. And they can't do that across 40 farms. So it's building that brand in whatever your intermediary organization is, building the brand, leveraging the brand of organizations like TEM that have actively said no to, you know, 80% of the offsets out there, and we're starting to say no to customers now. We're starting to screen them based on their ESG targets, their net zero targets, and their alignment to, you know, a decarbonized future.
Let's talk to the landscape. The reason why we're approaching it at landscape level, the idea that if you can find the commonality between farmers in a region, and that's the science-based targets for nature talk to landscapes as well. So the idea that you can, you know, find that commonality, perhaps there's a common transaction that can be replicated across a landscape that can scale a particular transaction beyond one farm and have a common kind of story that kind of might sit behind it.
Yeah, and I think commonality amongst, you know, as Rowan Foley so to clearly put it as core benefits, you know, the real reasons you're doing these projects other than carbon, having a commonality amongst all the aggregated projects. So say, for example, it's you're going for environmental planting and you're doing mixed species and you do that really well. You do the biodiversity component really well. That's got a huge premium, huge. So average, you know, spot price for generic carbon might be floating around the $35 mark. We can sell a mixed species environmental planting ACCU for $75 at scale. So they're pricing in the scarcity, but they're also pricing in the biodiversity benefits of the projects.
If we just talk about the bundling, so one of the bits of feedback we've had along the way is that a corporate buyer like Coca-Cola or a large corporate buyer looks to have a portfolio. So they really do need to deal with an institutional kind of broker in order to be able to get that portfolio effect, some credits from offshore, because they're not only managing the carbon exposure, but they're managing the price they pay. Is that a reasonable kind of proposition, or is that
yeah, they're managing price risk. They're trying to tick a whole number of boxes. So like a large multinational, they want, they operate across multiple jurisdictions. They want to have offsets that are representative of where they're operating often. But then they also, they don't just want to pay $75 for 500,000 offsets. It'd send them bankrupt. So they have to weave in the more affordable offsets that are still high integrity.
All right. Well, this kind of talks to that you spoke about the quality and the due diligence that you undertake on your buyers as well. And so this is a challenge I think Wardy spoke to earlier, where we had we've got at least two different farmers in our cohort, in our member council, who one farmer might say, I'm happy to sell under a WWF like trading policy, which is effectively would count out anyone under the safeguard mechanism who might be expected to pay kind of the highest price, if you like. So one of our farmers is happy to sell under the WWF trading policy because they think that's ethically where they'd like to see the credits to go. Another one might say, well, I'd like to be unrestricted. I'd like to be able to kind of maximize. I'm already doing good by the environment. I'd like to maximize the return to generate the economics that I need for this project to work. So we've been kind of working through this challenge, trying to understand, well, what does that mean for us as a mutual representing our members? How do we accommodate these different types of interests? Have you come across that kind of challenge and how?
Yeah. So we're grappling with that at the moment. And I won't pretend it's easy. We've developed an ethical screening process at TEM, basically designed to screen out customers that have, greenfield hydrocarbon projects that are not putting their money where their mouth is when it comes to their net zero targets. And it's complex because if you say no to one, then say no to the whole industry. And where we've landed is that each transaction needs to be informed. And it's not a hard and fast series of stage gates to block out companies. It's simply it's a way to inform a conversation that we can then take to, a farmers mutual to make informed decisions. I don't think there is any perfect clear-cut answer to that one. I think it's a process. And ultimately, I really do support the idea of having two streams, the very clear, no, we won't sell to Safeguard and the other. I mean, the Safeguards is complex, right? We're talking about organizations that have annual requirements of 2 million plus ACCUs per year. And there's a whole bunch of them and they all want quality. They're bending over backwards to make sure that they get quality. And we didn't think that. We thought, oh, they'll just want cheap and nasty. Not at all. They're willing to pay, $50, $52 for an ACCU. And they want really large volumes of it because they know they're going to get scrutiny. If it's not now, it'll be 5 years down the track.
Is that 50 spot or is that like forward as well?
Spot, 50 spot. We sold 150,000 this morning at 50. Yeah. So
whereabouts is the forward? Just so whereabouts is the forward?
Yeah. So we escalate based on an agreed percentage. But we're pretty, I think, bullish is the term on where it's all going.
You spoke about the different value, like the biodiversity or the social value. And it's one Bjorn and I met. We were members of the Biodiversity Markets Working Group. So we were looking basically 3 years ago. We were looking at how to help fertiliser biodiversity credit market. And that's coming, you know, the world's moving along like that. We've seen that you've got the TNFD, and I'm part of a World Economic Forum group now that's looking at having it the first biodiversity credit auction in the first quarter of next year. But you say that like that the value of biodiversity, because when we were speaking to yourself and Adrian, and you know, the response was, well, you know, investors are valuing biodiversity and the co-benefits already. So have you got a sense of what the, like, whether there is a likelihood of a split, you know, an opportunity to split the markets, or that like it really is simpler to have it hooked on carbon?
I think it's our interim vector, you know, like I would love for there to be a split and there to be clear, you know, voluntary biodiversity credit market that was super transparent and at scale. But at the moment, this is where the scale is, and we're seeing it. You know, we're seeing large purchases of carbon credits for primarily for their biodiversity value. It's not across the board. It is large corporations that want to take a leadership role in that space. They want to brand themselves as being leaders in both biodiversity and carbon. A lot of this tracks back to like CEOs and C-suite executives now having climate and nature as part of their KPIs, you know.
Right.
And this is so, instead of meeting with just the, you hear this a lot of these kind of conferences, instead of just meeting with the sustainability person, we're now meeting with the CFO, or, you know, the CEO is willing to go and meet the carbon producer that we're the sole pathway to market for. It's getting serious, and the scale's ramping up.
That's promising. Well, so certainly from a farming perspective, we know that we've spoken before and talking at lunch that it may well be that the Richard Eckard, I think someone was saying, has just done some forecasting suggesting that the ag sector is going to be net deficit. So it'll be like in terms of carbon from a carbon kind of sequestration perspective. So biodiversity, you know, potentially is actually probably the market that, you know, that the ag sector can offer most value in a sense.
And, you know, as was talked about before, like we're running out of sensible, viable land for carbon. The carbon demand, thanks to the safeguard mechanism, is soaring. Biodiversity is kind of the next frontier in that sense.
All right, one more question is in terms of this question, we're kind of talking environmental markets here, which is, you know, you guys, but the supply chain, we know that supply chains are looking for that insetting, looking to address the same concerns, and there's this kind of alignment that can happen between a consumer company, if you like, and their supply chain, where they can, you know, they've got a reason to buy the credits, or to kind of reward the credits within the supply chain. Are you seeing this kind of convergence, or how are you seeing the supply chains playing in your world?
Are we seeing, there's two things. One, we're seeing a lot of pressure from investors on our clients based on, you know, ESG screening of their supply chains, where they're basically saying, oh, you know what, that big offset deal we're talking about, we're not so keen on it anymore. We're going to go for electrification and abatement at source.
Yep.
And then we're also seeing an uptake in small to medium organizations coming to us for high quality, high integrity offsets. And we're to the point where we've had to set up TEM Online, which is like an online marketplace for high quality offsets, because the demand's growing so strongly.
All righty. Thanks, Bjorn.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Larissa, Rowan, and Bjorn. Was that a hand up, Rob, or is this a stretch? Excellent. Well, do you want to?
Generation Wealth Partners did, they looked at 300 of the top S&P companies, and out of the 300, only 9 of those companies that all your superannuation companies invest in will survive beyond 10 years. in the current the 6 planetary overshoots that's coming down the turnpike. Are these companies doing that because they know that they won't have a business unless they invest in insets and do the right thing down the supply chain? Or are they doing it because, you know, it's...
So really good question. I think there's two components of it that I'm able to answer. One is that when you come to tender, that's already a self-selecting process. Like you've come because you have made a decision at a board level or a senior leadership team level that you're going for quality and scale and all that. The other is just, you know, this tremendous pressure that we're seeing now from investors, from finance, ESG focused screening, that basically says, unless you do this, we won't invest in you.
All right, thank you, everyone. Steve, last question of the session, and then we're going into the farmers after this.
Sorry about this, but I can't help myself. I read a report 2 days ago that claimed that something like 90% of offsets, even high quality ones, are not working for one of two reasons, or both. One is double counting. So you buy, let's say you mentioned India and China, which are one of the major sources of renewable energy offsets. The claim is that those projects would have happened anyway. And so the investment in the offset is having no effect on the mitigation because they would have happened anyway. The other one is double counting, where those economies have their own equivalent of clean energy regulator. Those offset sellers are also reporting to their national economy, and that national economy is claiming those offsets, not offsets, but reductions as well. So, and this is true for over 90% of offsets. How do you make sure that your offsets don't suffer from one of those two problems?
Yeah, so this is precisely why TIM thrives, is because of the criticism to the market like this, which we welcome. We're very boutique, and we've gone after, you know, the best quality that we can get. You know, the recent Guardian controversy around cook stoves, for example, that the methodology was, you know, only sampling a really small amount, and that the whole thing was questionable. We had to then go out and do the new methodology. We lost half of the crediting of a very large project, but then became the sole place to buy that form of credit. So because we've positioned ourselves as sort of a go-to for quality and integrity, we actually benefit, not always, but we benefit from the criticism to the carbon market. How do we ensure that there's no double counting and that, you know, integrity and quality is present? And the only thing we can do is, you know, employ relevant experts, do due diligence, and do site visits. That's where we're at the moment.
I might just say that there is one other thing that when we talked with you and Adrian about that we liked, which was that you'll do a climate model, a 2-degree plan, and you'll say, well, if I'm going to plant trees in a 2-degree environment, those trees won't take, and you won't do the project. Whereas a lot of people will try.
So yeah, just for example, our human induced regeneration projects are at the top 5% in terms of permanence and rainfall. That's sort of where we're trying to set ourselves.
Okay, it's afternoon tea time. Please enjoy some chocolate and some conversation. We're going to be back here at 3:30. When the Kelpie comes around, that's me, and says, get in the room, get in the room. Thank you.
Yes, is the answer. Yes.
We'll have to go quiet now.
Ladies and gentlemen, we're coming to the final stage of our event today. We started with the environment, we moved into data and technology. Just now we've had customers and markets. And the last section today is called Farmers at the Centre. And as with all good events, we're rolling with the punches a little bit. The first speaker of today has had a child taken ill and is having to attend a Zoom. And so you will hear Oscar's voice, like a voice from God, but you will not see Oscar. And I'll ask Oscar to be the provocateur, and then we'll hear in the real world from Roger. And Roger, you'll have to come here and slide through your slides. So Oscar, if you can hear me, can you commence your talk?
Hey, Wardy, you can hear me there now, mate? Goodness
We
me,
can.
the technology
Go for it.
works. Awesome. Well, thanks everyone, and apologies. And yep, kid's good now. Unfortunately, rural medical supplies and services aren't so crash hot. But anyway, okay, so we're here today. You've got Roger Fitzgerald in the room with you, and Roger's a pretty exceptional farmer. So Roger and I are both from a part of northern New South Wales called Moree. It's the biggest gross value of agricultural production shire in the country. We produce more on average every year, over $1 billion in a normal year of ag product. Ag is huge in our neck of the woods. But at the same time, there's some impacts from that. That huge growth in agricultural production has come without doubt at the expense of some of our natural capital assets. The farming environments and the nature of changing land use has seen the degradation or the removal of certain ecosystems. And I've got to say, there's a big financial driver for it. And even today, when we were hearing about natural capital markets or reduced loans, it's still very touch and go as to whether environmental markets are the most viable land use for farmers, and particularly in high value, high production regions. As Meg said, you know, some of those East Coast regions with high rainfall and high productivity, that's where the balance becomes hardest. Finding a commercial way to make nature or ecosystem services work on your farm can be really, really difficult in that context. And so that's why I'm very proud to know and be a friend of Roger's, because this guy is pretty exceptional. He's managed to make it work. He's taken the ecosystem values on his farm and he's enhanced it, and he's found a way to market it. So Roger, without further ado, mate, can you tell us a little bit about what you do, who you are, and how you make it work?
Thank you. I just got to put on a slide to show you where we are.
IT guy, hang on, Roger. Scroll down. Just don't have to go.
Thanks, Woody. So that's where we are at North Prairie, north of Moree and west of the Newell Highway, which is a bit of a locator for dryland farming, dryland grain growing, and a bit of cotton. And so these are the biodiversity sites on North Prairie. You can see that it's an L-shaped block in the middle of a highly modified landscape. So it's a family farm, basically. We don't represent a lot of that production that Oscar was talking about, but we do have a little bit of grain. And those orange areas were set-asides under the New South Wales Land Management Code in order that we could develop 100 hectares of farming around that gooseneck section at the top, the black soil. So I'd been trying to find a linear developer who would help us preserve some of the family's vegetation. In 2014, there was a murder just across the road on the Newell Highway, and the landholder shot a really nice environmental compliance officer. I sort of called him one of nature's gentlemen, but the guy that shot him wasn't a very good shot. And he took about 3 shots at him, missed his headshot. 10 minutes later, got him in the shoulder, hard shot, and then shot him in the back as he tried to run for cover and, in the dark. So this did not impress a lot of people in the district. And so there's a general movement now to a much more balanced approach to what we're doing out there. So that's how I got involved.
I bid on a conservation agreement and got awarded a conservation agreement, and I think it was $20 a hectare that was going to bring in something like $20,000 a year. And so we decided instead of that to do some further production to clear out some of the invasive woody weeds and to set aside those orange areas. And then with the remnant vegetation that we had left, we entered into a biodiversity offset agreement with Inland Rail. And so the areas that are not shaded in is the areas that we still own and can deal with. Just north of that watercourse in the middle of the farm, we've decided to extend the biodiversity to some alluvial grasslands, which are pretty uncommon in the district now. So we think this is a pretty good program, the New South Wales Biodiversity Stewardship Agreement that we've got. And so we want to extend that. We're going to extend it from 170 hectares to 200 hectares. And then in addition to that, we've got this another 200 of set aside. The set aside's very low duty. The biodiversity offsets is very high duty. So we fence them off, and that sort of thing. The thing that we like about it is it helps us preserve some vegetation in the district and on farm. It also very good, Claire is going to talk about succession planning, but if you've got people that want to leave the business, under the scheme, they actually buy the country off you, but you still own it. So you get a lump sum for the value of the land that you've tied up in perpetuity. And then the remaining partners have got an enterprise on the land through biodiversity stewardship, where they get a regular annual management payment, about 4 times what it would have been if we'd gone to a conservation agreement. So it fits in very well with the dryland cropping because you're not dependent on rainfall for that income. And a lot of the operations and that you're doing fit in very well with the farming cycle and the arrangements that we have there. And also, it's very good from a corporate social responsibility point of view, because a lot of these people that are sort of surrounding us are corporate superannuation funds and so on. Yeah, it's got a lot of good aspects that we think it's a really good program. So we're very happy.
So Roger, you're talking about a high-end, high-value product. So, and for context, everyone, the open offer that the BCT offers, which Roger looked at initially, in our neck of the woods doesn't even cover your local government rates. So, there's an understanding there that some parts of these products are quite, low value, but Roger's managed to tap into a high value thing with a specific offset market where he's able to really optimize the land value and get that capital up front. So that's a huge part of it. Roger, the other thing that you are, though, aside from being a good land steward and a farmer, is also you're an accountant. You've had a career in the industry, and you understand the finances of it all. Do you want to can we just jump ahead to one of the other questions we were going to talk about a bit later? But the idea of, so what's going on with your program? Are there capital gains issues or tax issues? I mean, we're talking about certificates being issued. So do you have the capacity to manage those issues in terms of tax? And how are you approaching the carbon part of it? Are you able to count carbon on your systems at the same time, or is this a one shot? Jumping to question 3, sorry, mate.
Thanks, Oxa. So Claire's going to actually talk about business succession and taxation next. But part of the problem is the New South Wales government got together with Treasury in Canberra and decided that they were going to subject all these offset credits to capital gains tax. And so we've owned this vegetation for 100 years, and now that we're putting it aside for the conservation, we're now being taxed on it. And not only that, but the price that they put on it is millions of dollars that they put into a trust fund and drip feed to you over the time, and you pay tax on that money and you've got to earn it. And then they also tax you on the lump sum that you receive. And it's all taxed at the time it's created. So it's usually the case that a lot of farmers will have concessional mechanisms to avoid capital gains tax liability. But now that we're going to an extension, we've used a lot of those concessional lifetime limits. And so a lot of the benefits of the program that the program designers intend are being washed out. Oscar, you asked about carbon credits and getting eligible for them. That's also a problem because the New South Wales government are trying to avoid any rorting of this program, and so they won't let you double dip. So even though you're meeting several different objectives, several different programs, you're only limited to this program. Another example is set aside areas. We don't have a lot of obligations to do a lot of active management. But if we could enter into offset agreements on those, we could really improve the condition of that vegetation. And if it's the parkland in Sydney, for example, they can get offsets on Crown land. So there's a number of problems which I believe needed to be sorted out over time, but I'd still recommend this program as a really good deal.
We might have to sit you and Meg Evans down and you can sort out the Commonwealth and state governments. But I guess, Roger, one of the other questions we were going to discuss was on your next slide was, actually getting it done. I mean, how did you go in terms of this process, finding your buyers, understanding how to do it, just for the real audience, the virtual online audience, while you guys were having your last coffee break, we started having a chat about this. There's acronyms everywhere. It's complexity. How the hell do you navigate through all this stuff? How do you figure out who to get advice from and how to work out what you need to do and what's going to fit your circumstance?
Well, this slide's I've acknowledged our ecological advisors, Eco Planning, and the ecologists are really good, but they're not always good at answering phone calls. They're usually out in the field. And some of the regulating ecologists are, bent on using their knowledge to make it difficult. But this was a bit of a flowchart that I did. The top line is the legal agreement and the liaison with the railway. And the bottom line is the arrangements we had with the government and the timeframes. So it took us over a year. It was like trying to be a submarine. So eventually we got a bit of project management software and tried to rationalise the critical path. But it's why an organisation like Regen Mutual would be a very valuable asset to have. We had Inland Rail, and unlike a lot of the linear developers that we went to initially, they said, if you want to get an offset credit, you've got to put all your vegetation on a register and we'll then come and look at it. And for most farmers, you guys don't really want to drop your DAX and show the public what you've got because we know what's going to happen next. And so I was very reluctant to do that process. But when we discovered Inland Rail, they actually sponsor you and help you through the bureaucratic processes. So that was a real benefit to us. A lot of the public infrastructure authorities are now entering into a sponsorship arrangement too.
Yeah, so it really reinforces that need for trusted brokers, information sources, as well as pointers as to commercial or even government services that you can or need to tap into. And look, you went better than I did, Roger. The RTC came to us as well with some prospective offers, and I was a bit too scared because it was a show everything initially offer, but the fact that you were then able to take it forward and navigate it into a marketable product is pretty extraordinary. I suppose.
So some of these processes, you have to get mortgagee consent, getting the valuations, getting the ecologists lined up. So yeah, it was quite daunting the first time through. I was actually their guinea pig, I think. And so it took a lot of rough edges off the process going through it.
And it's kind of extraordinary. I mean, you're talking about a high value product there. And for people looking at smaller projects, the on cost could be really significant. And again, it just points to this thing that we need better market facilitation and services and advice in the industry if these projects are going to be taken up. You know, we're not all 10, 20,000 hectare farmers that can afford the investment required to get all of this specific advice, and particularly when we're talking about small areas. Roger,
Well,
I guess one of the
things that you find out along the way that you're just not aware of. For example, we had a koala appear in the middle of the drought, and that added a lot of value to the deal, but we didn't capture that value because we'd already entered into the arrangement. So things like species credits, a lot of the brokers and that are in this space, they're not always working in favour of the farmer. We were lucky to find a good one.
Yeah. Roger, I guess one of the issues here is the issue of outcomes. You know, a lot of the speakers earlier today have been talking about, well, how do we measure it? How do we set a baseline and whatnot? So do you want to talk us through that? What was your outcome versus income versus your inputs versus compliance monitoring? How's that process working? Are you getting regularly inspected, or what's the verification process for the ARTC as the buyer of that OSFED and for the New South Wales government as facilitators of the BCT? How does that process work, and is that a difficult or an easy thing for you to navigate?
Yeah, that's an interesting aspect, because on the 7:30 report the other night, there was a chap from the ANU in Canberra talking about the new federal scheme. And he said we need 3 types of monitoring. He said we need compliance monitoring, make sure people are doing what they're supposed to be doing under the agreement. We need input monitoring, make sure that they're spending the money we're giving them. And then we need outcome monitoring. And so I was just horrified when I heard that, because I've entered into an outcome-based contract, and the payments follow provided you're getting the outcomes that you've signed up to, the benchmarks and the ecological measurements. But there's always that uncertainty with the people that are monitoring your annual report every year, because this is a heavy-duty, high-value conservation agreement. And so they're always, for example, with the flood, we couldn't get onto the country, and so they want us to catch up now. And that's a really nice way of doing it. You know, they're giving us a bit of flexibility. But at the same time, they want to know how much money we've spent on things and how many hours we've put into weed control and those sort of things. And I'm sort of saying, well, no, this is an outcome-based contract. But it's really in the farmer's own interests to have a bit of a blended monitor for activity, inputs and outcomes. So we've got 2 more.
Yeah, and that's really important to know. Yeah, I mean, this isn't you know, sometimes these ideas are sold as we'll plant a few trees or we'll save a few areas and you know, the check will roll up, and it's a lot more complex and there's a lot more management there. And whether it's in your scenario or in the scenario of a farmer who's now looking at this IFRS reporting compliance in their supply chains and their finance, we are going to have to start monitoring in new ways and recording things in new ways. I know for IFSR, I'm changing our farm management software so that I'm going to be able to record the right things, so that when, you know, Ruminati will, hey mate, or some other company, you know, that I'm reporting our emissions through, I'm going to be able to needing a new set of data that I've got on hand. And if I don't have that, I just can't comply with these requirements. So there's a lot more than just, you know, doing the on-ground work. There's also that demonstrated inputs, etc. work that we're going to have to start doing as farmers everywhere, and more so if we want to tap into these high-value markets. So, Roger, a lot of speakers already talked about this, but, you know, going forward, international standards, ISSB, climate change risks, biodiversity reporting requirements. What do you reckon? What's your takeaway? What are we going to be doing in 3, 5, 10 years time, and how are we going to be able to do that?
Well, I think there's going to be a lot more emphasis on ecological responsibility. But it is looking at a risky climate production. And so I'm seeing this biodiversity enterprise as something that's going to help us through the tough times.
And looking at it in that, I mean,
Limit on how much country's available for these sort of arrangements. You could see that from that aerial photo.
yeah, for sure. And that's always going to be that offset, offset versus trading. What will we producing ag or biodiversity or carbon? Yep. We're getting the wind up, Woody.
You are, mate. Sorry about this. I'm coming in stage right, but I will let Roger answer that. So, Roger, come back and answer if you heard Oscar's question.
I didn't hear it.
You didn't? Oh, yeah. I've gone and stuffed it up. We're just going to do some quick IT things. Can I just say thank you, Oscar, for all your support and for participating in today's session. Thank you, Roger. Folks, we have 3 more sessions to go. This other session has been affected by ill health. So what we had hoped to do was to explore the issues around tax and equity and accounting. And to that end, we'd got a solicitor and a barrister. But unfortunately, the barrister's children have fallen ill. And so we've got a great workaround. Claire, am I able to talk to this? And this is a uniquely good opportunity. If you go to the Miro board and you have questions, the barrister has promised to answer any questions that we don't get to. So may I encourage you to take this opportunity of getting a barrister to answer your tricky and tax questions. All right, I'm going to ask Claire Booth from Claire Booth Lawyers in Dubbo, who's kindly flown out here after, massive amount of work in the last few weeks. She only just got back from Mungandai on one plane, had time to change, and then took a plane to Sydney this morning to be here with us today. So Claire, over to you.
Thank you so much. Well, good afternoon, everyone. It is an absolute privilege to be here, and I want to acknowledge Stephen Todd if he's in the audience. Okay, hi Stephen. Hi Stephen. My understanding is that I'm here because of your recommendation. Today, we're just going to spend 20 minutes going through some really quite important topics that I'm seeing are being missed, and there are some catastrophic consequences that we're starting to see in any emerging industry such as this. Failure to plan will actually mean that the introduction of carbon and biosecurity credits will be the new death duties that effectively bankrupted rural Australia in the 1960s, 70s, and before CGT came in 85. I'm a solicitor. I've worked in Newcastle, in Oxford. I was in Gundawindi for 3 years. And then I have been in Dubbo for about 12 years. And I did an Nuffield scholarship about 6 years ago, which was looking at some trends that were happening in agriculture. And those trends really were, when I first commenced legal practice in the world of agricultural succession, it was absolutely the case that off-farm children were very happy to receive token amounts of wealth. So that might be $150,000 worth of BHP shares or a small house. Those days are well and truly over. We're also seeing an increase in Australian divorce rates. So 2 out of 3 marriages will now statistically end, irrespective of whether they're a de facto relationship or whether they're married. We're seeing wills being challenged. So I'm seeing about 40% of wills that I'm aware of being challenged. Thank you. Am I able to look at the screen at all, or should I look at this? Nope, that's okay. And increasingly, as I think a lot of us understand, we need to vertically integrate as primary producers. We all need to aggregate, or we need to be aware of our gross margins as we are increasing our trend towards commoditisation, lower profit, and more challenging times with climate. So I've got off-farm kids no longer receiving the token amount, and increasingly on-farm children are having to take a lot more debt, and then throw into the mix really complex income that's coming from biodiversity credits, carbon, hydrogen, solar or wind. It's an interesting time. You're wanting me to stand still so people, yeah, got it. Okay. This presentation, this slide, and I'm about to show you why it hasn't changed since 2021. I really get the shits when you see someone trot out a slide from a couple of years ago, wonder whether they've actually bothered to put something together. But I did double check with Rabo this morning. This slide is really here to demonstrate why, when you are approaching in your family business, the conversation about do we enter into any agreements and how do we do that, you need to be conscious around everyone in the family, because they certainly are aware that Australian agriculture is and has been the fastest growing asset class in Australia. And in April of this year, Rural Bank, so I wanted to make sure it wasn't just Rabo, okay? So Wes Lafoy should be credited for the previous slide. So if you've got an asset class which is currently being increased in terms of its value by a range of mechanisms, which I'll let you run through there, you need to be conscious around that everyone around the table is aware that this is now a very sexy asset class. And whilst the current banking environment is changing and changing fast, and an example of that is per $1 million worth of debt, you used to be able to, over the last 3 years, take an interest rate of say 3%. The bank was happy with serviceability of say 2 times interest cover. 3% times 2 is 6%. If your EBIT out of $1 million was, sorry, I'm trying not to walk around. So in the event that your $1 million worth of debt, you needed to be able to service 60,000 of that, okay? And if you were able to show in your EBIT, earnings before interest and tax, that you were easily managing that, then that was a really good B or A class customer for most of the big 4 banks. Now, at the moment, some people in the room might be experiencing 6 to 7% interest rates times 2, 12 to 14%. And you're assuming that our equity partners are still really comfortable with 2 times interest cover, but they're not. So the debt serviceability around debt has changed. It's now 3 to 3.5%. So using 3% at 7%, that's now 21%. So of your available EBIT, you now need to demonstrate a whole lot more serviceability. At the same time, on the equity side of the page, we're seeing people previously assuming in dryland grazing and dryland cropping that 60% equity was sufficient and they could borrow 40%. If you're an irrigator, there's different rules. However, those days are changing. So equity really is no longer something which the banks are particularly interested in. From where I'm sitting, it's actually serviceability. And for me, it's a wonderful opportunity to see clients actually being creative and saying, well, how do we create a return on our assets? Is it through traditional production or is it through other means? I really think it's important that we acknowledge that low interest rates, high commodity prices and good seasons have really been very much part of, from when I commenced agriculture, so age 28 to 40. Those days, I think, are probably coming to an end at the moment. So it'll be really interesting to see this negative capital growth figure in the North Coast, whether that's actually going to flow through. No one really knows. So why is it that debt and land values are incredibly important before we have a conversation about income, tax, land tax, revenue law? So I'm going to assume that most people here don't believe me when I say that NAB from 1970 to 2022 can show that the average annual increase in land values in Australian agriculture is between 6 to 11%. Most of my clients say bullshit. They say, can you please use 3%, please? So I do. So as you can see in this column, so my husband's Brendan, he's 40, my son's Lachlan. I ran out of time this morning. So Lucy, who's 3, is very important and equal to Lachlan, but not on there. So you can see down this column in 2023, we're using the rate of increase at 3%. We're assuming the farm is worth 8 million. We're assuming we're paying about 32.5%. So we're making about 120 grand in income a year, okay? And we've got 2 million bucks worth of debt. So let's wind forward to Brendan and Claire's succession plan. So because Brendan and Claire bought their first farm at 28, we have ensured that at the time that we turn 60, we hand over management to our children because we think we enjoyed it, so they should. So Lachlan's 20, and unless he has a ex-nuptial child, I don't like his girlfriend or boyfriend or whatever, okay? I'm still the appointor, so, you know. It's 2043. So this document here is trying to show you, I need you to sit on your gravestone when you're 95. I need you to visualize what life is going to be when you're 75, 65, 55, okay? And it's really hard to do unless you have a spreadsheet. So this spreadsheet shows you in 2043, Brendan's 60, Lachlan's 27, okay? We've had 3% growth in that entire time. We've still got $2 million worth of debt because we're only servicing the interest. And we can see there that at the time that it is transferred, the land is 14.4. We've had a capital gain of 6.4. 50% of that is taxable. We've then got tax after the 50% discount. Percentage of the tax is 7.3. We then are no longer eligible for some intergenerational stamp duty exemption. So we've got to replace that asset with stamp duty. And we've got a few legals in there and accounting costs. So the total CGT tax and transaction cost is 1.7. So net value is 12. So 12.3% of that value of that farm at that time is consumed in poor planning. And then we add on the debt because it hasn't gone anywhere. So the value of the farm that has been consumed by costs is 26.1. So that there is a really conservative figure. What's far more interesting for me is that we actually use a real life example like 7%. And you might remember that you've experienced between 15 to 40% changes over the last few years. So if you happen to die in the wrong year, you're fucked, right? So just in this example, the exact same figures, okay? The only thing I've changed is 7%. So at the time that we transfer the land to Lachlan or to a structure that Lachlan controls, the farm's worth 31. The capital gain over that time's 22. As you can see, the taxable capital gain after the 50% discount's 11. Tax payable is 3.7, that's 12%. We've then got the replacement stamp duty because we're no longer a primary producer and we've stuffed up our revenue planning. So we've lost 17.1% and then we've still got the debt and we're at 23.5. So this is a really good example of why, in addition to reading the deed and the document, that you actually need to spend far more time asking yourself, where am I going to be in 10 years' time? What is my family going to be doing in 20 years' time? Should we actually be holding this income in a flexible structure? I know the accountant in 2023 wants me to have a partnership because it makes things easy and I don't like paying accounting fees. But if you actually weigh up the compounding impact of having a simplified structure, you are going to shit out tax. Now, and I mean this in all seriousness, because this is a death duty. You might remember that you used to have 3 farms and 1 would be sold to cover the death duty, 23.5%. I want to do a positive presentation one day. I feel like everyone trots me out to scare them. So I'm sorry if I'm... Why am I talking about this slide? There was a question by someone which said, what happens to my carbon or biodiversity project if there's a succession event or sale? So this came through on the email from Andrew. And my answer was privity of contract. Now, why is a lawyer talking to you about privity of contract? Privity of contract is saying when you have a contract, it takes place between party A and party B. We know that that contract is duous. It goes through a power of attorney. It goes through an estate. It goes through a trust document. If there's a company involved, it continues on until the company is wound up. But what I think is really important is this story from 1861. So there's a contract between A and B, and we know that they can't impose obligations on C. We know that a contract between A and B cannot be enforced by C, even if a contract is instead intended to benefit C. So this story talks about the father of a bride promised the father of the groom to pay the groom, the plaintiff, a sum of money upon the marriage to his daughter. However, before making this payment, the bride's father died and his estate refused to honour his promise. The plaintiff sued for the money but failed on the ground that although the contract had been made for his benefit, he was not a contracting party because the person who'd made the contract had died. So why am I talking to you about privity of contract? Privity of contract is trying to explain to you, unless you have a law degree, unless you have practiced in commercial documents for 10 years, do not sign a thing. You need to understand, does your power of attorney engage with this document? Does your will engage with this document? Does your bank understand this document? Does your mortgage actually understand this document? If you have a plant and equipment loan or a general security agreement, which everyone does, it's like a tablecloth. It goes over the land and anything it touches, it has security on, okay? Does your general security agreement engage with this document? Most people want to pay their lawyer $3,000, just have the document explained to them as to what it means. But I want you to ask your solicitor and accountant who are in the room at the time, what does this mean in this situation? What happens if I lose capacity? What happens if dad is in a nursing home for 10 years? What happens if dad's estate is litigated for 5 years? What happens? And when does that income change in terms of taxation? The next question that I was asked by Andrew was, what sort of structure should my project reside in for maximum flexibility? So flexibility is where lawyers love to play. Accountants, they don't like flexibility normally because flexibility creates a bit more complexity. And in this area of law, simplicity in terms of partnerships and sole trader gives the accountant a few more options. So you have a trade-off here. If the question is about flexibility, well, then you're going to pay a little bit more income tax as you go through, but you're going to get a whole lot more options in terms of your estate and succession plan. So the turnover of the audience, I'm assuming, is somewhere between 50,000 to 5 million. And I said, I think this question should be written differently. Instead, I think the better question could be, if I'm a grazier with a gross income of, say, less than 500,000, is there a preferred business structure? And my answer to that is probably a discretionary trust if you are in solely the space of carbon and biodiversity credits. If you're receiving income from a solar, wind or hydrogen, and you've got a very high turnover business, so you might have some cropping or irrigation, or you've got a stud, then that changes that. If I have a company structure, do I still access income tax averaging? That's a really easy one. No, I don't know whoever asked that, but that's an easy one. If I run the farm as a trust, am I still able to get an FMD? No. Okay. But to be honest with you, FMDs they're kind of like acid wash genes. There's far better ways and more sophisticated ways to save $1, okay? Why do graziers with turnover of less than 500,000 prefer partnership over companies and trusts? Because normally graziers understand a partnership. So my challenge, and one of the things that I really asked people to do after my Nuffield report, was increase your literacy. You guys are custodians of farmland, which could be between 5 million to 500 million and in between. And if you don't understand your structure, well, that's on you. Oh, and also, if anyone here is a sole trader in 2023, you need to genuinely get a different accountant. Providing concessional tax treatment for carbon abatement, there was a question which was asked in relation to whether or not income from carbon is still enabled in FMD. The answer is yes. As you know, that law came through in July. The second question was, what sort of structures am I allowed to have to trade in agriculture and still receive concessional tax treatment? So the answer to that question is, who's the business? Who is the person carrying on the primary production business? And that person can be a human being, a partner in a partnership, but they have to be human partners. So it can't be a partnership of companies or a partnership of trusts, and beneficiaries of a trust, not a unit trust. It has to be a discretionary trust, or it can be a trust from an estate, like a testamentary trust. Is a carbon project considered farm income or an asset? So this is a really good question. So the answer really is, if the bank thinks a carbon project is a net negative because they perceive that income as a liability, you've got two answers. One, the bank is always right because they're your equity partner. And if you are having trouble with that bank, go and find a different bank. And I mean that in all seriousness. There are different banks who've got different policies and different lending criteria. And if you have entered into an agreement with a bank with a fixed term loan over 10 years, so they're offering 15-year facilities at the moment, privative contract will enable you to use that policy for the next 10 or 15 years. So get creative. Is a carbon project on farm or on off farm income? There's all these questions here, which I won't be reading, but we're going to give you guys some really detailed advice. So whilst Nina, who's 7, is really unwell, and you don't get the benefit of Michael Bennett today, you'll get something even better, which is a barrister writing something through me to you guys, which is kind of pretty cool. Additionally, we're going to be talking about in those drought years where you're getting far more income from carbon projects and you're not getting that income from wheat, sheep, grazing, what happens to land tax GST on the sale of farm? Really important, so important. If you're in drought for 5 years prior to selling the farm, this needs to be tattooed somewhere in your underarm. Be really careful, okay? And if you think you're going to die in the middle of a drought, be really careful about that, okay? We'll just have a will which covers the event of death. So you can control your will and that can control the GST treatment. So make sure your will is a really good one. For me, there are all sorts of ways to ensure that we've got a partnership so that we tick off the carbon stuff. We've got a primary production business or a trust. From a risk perspective, most of my clients will employ people in a separate company. So if we have a work health and safety or a death on farm, it silos the issue and it doesn't sabotage the underlying farm business. If we're doing any manufacturing, then obviously we're getting raw product from the head company and it's going through, including studs. For spray drift and any of the croppers in the room, especially around Moree, we definitely don't operate tractors or apply chemical in the head company where all the income is. So I'll always get an inversion or a spray drift case. I put a bullet in that company, set up a new company and off we go. Then if there's income from carbon, then it can be received into a company and then distributed out to a partnership. So for me, this is one of the structures that I've been working on at the moment, which is working quite well. And I got a private ruling from the ATO. They verified it was fine. So I'm going to finish on this slide. This slide basically says, measure twice, 3 times, and then cut once. So if you're a parent and you're married to someone, are you on the same page? If you're not, statistically, that is going to increase your risk of your estate being litigated. How much of this income is actually being applied to mum and dad? has the bank included any of this income in their cash flows for the underlying business? And if they have, well, we can't actually provide it in the succession plan to the off-farm children. And more importantly, have we got it in writing from the bank that they're going to exclude that income as part of serviceability? And most of the time, banks are really unwilling to do that. Thank you. I hope that's been enjoyable.
Yeah, that was amazing. Thank you very much. Oh, Cam, quick question. Claire, have you got a card or can I connect you with Cam? Yes, excellent. Cam, meet Claire, Claire, meet Cam. Look, isn't it great to have a lawyer who will talk straight and simply and, you know, drop an F-bomb occasionally and tell you how it is? When they're paid by the minute, you know, they tend to be verbose. All right, now we've kind of covered a bit of the traps and challenges and the tax and stuff. And what I'd like to do is introduce Melina Morrison from the Business Council of Cooperatives and Mutuals and Rob Pekin from Food Connect Shed. Now, these two wonderful human beings are often dealing with groups of farmers, similar to what we have with Regen Farmers Mutual. Farmers have come together to aggregate their market power. And so this session on farmer market power is going to be led by some people who've had firsthand experience of said market power for decades. Now, we're just having, as you would like to see, some IT issues. So give me a second. Dave, can I just check in with you? How's the, is everybody online still? They're able to see and hear? Yep. We're good to go? All right. Melina, are you our provocateur? I'll give you this one. Thank you.
Thank you, Wardy. So thanks for putting me between co-ops and social enterprises, between you guys and a drink. But that was a fantastic presentation from Claire. I'll definitely be coming to have a chat to you. And in terms of what Roger and Oscar were talking about as well, I think the segue is that this is really about what makes farming successful. And my key interlocutor here today is Robert, and we promise you that by the end of your session, you will have, if not been convinced that the lens that we're looking through what makes farming successful is ownership and the control of supply chains, is that the ownership has to be with producers and consumers. If we haven't convinced you of that, then at least we hope you've thought about it a little bit. So what does that all mean? The first provocation I'm going to put to you is it's about thinking about who gets to control the market, who gets to control supply chains, who gets to be a price maker, and who is the price taker. And when we're thinking about farming, when we're thinking about carbon markets, when we're thinking about control of vertically integrated supply chains, like how we get food on our plate, it's critical that the right people, the right stakeholders are the owners of the business, or they have the supply chain control to get the outcomes that we want. And if we might like to think about something quite close to home, we're an island nation. So I'm going to talk a little bit about food security. You know, we've been increasingly exposed in the last few years to climate change, expressed as natural disasters, pandemics, geopolitical tensions, trade barriers, workforce challenges. These are all the things we've heard today that are making farming difficult. Food security is an example of something that we take for granted, and yet only one co-op, that's a member-owned business, that's a primary producer-owned business in Australia, stands between us having continued systemically large domestically owned supply chains in each of these three commodities: protein, grain, and dairy. It is hard to imagine that we could be a net importer of dairy, but it's not so far-fetched. If you examine, for example, the current vertical integration of dairy processing that is occurring, for example, with Coles proposing to buy some critical processing plants for dairy in regional Victoria. We have already ceded key advanced food and beverage markets to foreign ownership in favour of offshore shareholders. Farmers and Australian consumers lose out when we get a tin of canned beetroot that has been grown here, exported somewhere else, tinned, canned, processed, canned, and exported back onshore, not to mention what that does to our carbon footprint. So it really is farmers and Australians that continue, consumers, to lose out in these markets. And anything short of producer control of supply chains, and I would say the same again for carbon markets, is going to work against farming being sustainable, profitable, and successful. And that's a provocation for you to think about and perhaps to interrogate and reflect back. I was going to leave Rob with a few provocations that we've been talking about and let some things just hang in the air. The first provocation is that Australians have all the food security they need, because food security is a problem experienced mainly in the developing world. The provocation too is that supermarkets will always have more power than producers. And that's a fact of life because Australians want cheap food. And provocation 3 is that carbon trading can never work in the interest of farmers or the environment because the system is just another way to reward shareholders. What do you make of this, Robert? Do you agree?
No.
Disagree?
No, and thanks for all the previous speakers today. It's been very inspiring, and a few have really challenged me in areas that I hadn't thought of. I'm not going to drop my DAX today, but I do think there is a real opportunity to create a self-licking ice cream. And so just to give you a bit of context, I'm, along with my partner, Emma Kate, we're the founders of the Food Connect Shed in Brisbane, which is a 540 community-owned piece of infrastructure in Brisbane with about 37 tenants in there, all pretty much all food. We do have some ecosystem, other social enterprises in the building that provide ecosystem services, so accountancy, marketing, law. And then we're surrounded by a whole ecosystem in the Brisbane Southeast Queensland network and nationally with lots of other crazy people reinventing the food system from the roots. So my comments, to give you that context, are going to come from that really looking seriously at the third or the fourth question, depending on which holistic farm planning course you did, what is the root cause of the problem that we're trying to solve. So, and these are great questions because they're sort of going right to that today. And today we've heard from great speakers who have sort of meandered from looking at the root cause, like the first speaker today. I don't know if she's here still. Yeah, she's up the back of the room when she said, if the market or the financial system created all these problems that we're sitting in today, why are we looking to you to solve them? And that's damn right, we shouldn't be. We should be saying, no, you guys step aside and you go and do a few courses and then come back to us and talk to us and we'll talk about things then. So no longer should farmers or anyone who's involved in land restoration should no longer be thinking about which knee we're going to get down on to beg for money. We should be standing from not from a high moral ground, but from a ground of really that we as farmers, and I'm an ex-dairy farmer, and people involved in the mutuals, we're not inventing something new here by talking about place-based ownership or unlocking capital to go back into into mutuals or into cooperatives or into regional communities, and really sort of starting to look at that root cause. So as I intimated in the question I asked the previous speaker, not the lawyer, but the guy who was speaking about the markets and why are these big companies putting millions of dollars, why are the C-suite, why is the C-suite now have KPIs around nature-based solutions and things like that? It's because they know the signals. The insurance companies have been saying it for 20 or 30 years, and now it's the finance. The investors are saying, yeah, you need to lift your game because we know you're not going to be in business. The modelling is clearly showing that. So yeah, we do. We have incredible inequities, particularly if you look at First Nations people in Australia. We have food insecurity problems. Kirsten and I did a thing, I don't know how long, 15 years ago in a suburb in Melbourne called Casey, where there was the first sort of classified food desert in Australia. You know, tremendous, or tremendous, I shouldn't say the word tremendous, but really high rates of obesity, really high rates of malnutrition, really high rates of diabetes, and all sorts of things, because that suburb is basically just full of all of the fast food chains and a couple of big supermarkets, but bugger all in the way of fresh food that people can go and get. In fact, they work so hard in that suburb, they basically drive out the door in their car, and the breakfast is a fast food breakfast. They drop the kids off at school, and it's a big commute. I think it was like 80 or 90% of the population of Casey have to drive out of their suburb to get work. And then when they're coming back, they're doing the same thing. And I don't know what the population is, but it's a massive population. OzHarvest, one of our tenants at the Food Connect shed is OzHarvest. They've gone from an $18 million revenue company 4 years ago to now $36 million revenue in philanthropy and government grants to cover for the food insecurity problem they're trying to address by diverting food waste across to. But of course, and most people in the room would know that the diversion of food waste from it being converted to methane in landfill to just delivering that to someone's empty mouth is the same amount of emissions. So the CO2 equivalent of the methane is around about the same as them going and picking up the food from the supermarkets and then delivering that to a whole bunch of community services around the area. So it's a negative gain or loss there. So, but of course they're feeding people, so it's a really good thing. They're feeding people who need that food. So it's a real challenge. So yes, we've got massive problems around food insecurity. And as a country, the root cause of why we've got such poor leadership at our political and corporate level is because a country can only be measured by its lowest common denominator. And we're not valuing the incredible and profound knowledge that our First Nations people have. And of course, they're the ones who are suffering most from and for those of you who don't, you heard Rowan speak earlier today, if you don't understand the profound knowledge that First Nations wisdom has in terms of what we've got to do in the next 10 years, it's incredible that we're not valuing that knowledge by feeding them better and getting food out to their communities and doing a lot more in that space. The second provocation was around supermarkets will always have the power. Well, their business model and obviously during COVID, it was really affected. They've gone from 27 central distribution centres in 2007 down to 5 just before COVID. They're now revisiting that scheme, but it's an incredible, it's a big risk for them, and that's why we had supermarket shelves empty, was because logistically they couldn't get into those central distribution centres and out. We've got a couple of tenants in our shed that are into blended flour products, gluten-free. They had to pay truck drivers to wait in the line for 3 or 4 days to get into those central distribution centres that Coles and Woolies rely on. So, so the world is changing right in front of us at this very point in time, and supermarkets, whilst they get a social licence from OzHarvest and Second Bite and Food Bank, that's quickly running out of favour. You only have to go into a supermarket and you can see that, most of the middle aisles are full of the most unhealthy things you would ever want to buy. Coca-Cola, junk food, like it is really, really sad that they're doing, and that's coming under close scrutiny by dietitians, by population health specialists, and by the Department of Health, because the health budget has been going like that because of the cheap food, particularly now in this the first I suppose 12 months. We're in the cost of living crisis, which is really impacting on the health budget, and the government are saying we just can't service this health budget the way we did. So and this comes to this power issue is where, it's only 40 years that the supermarkets have done this. Obviously, they own gambling and they own pubs and they own insurance and they own a whole bunch of other things that they can dip into that big pocket for and then subsidise food to regain that market power. But we know that market power is coming at a huge cost to a lot of people.
Is it coming at a cost to farmers?
It's coming at a cost to farmers. Obviously, I'm a victim of the dairy deregulation, where all the dairy farmers thought most of the dairy farmers thought this would be a great thing. But of course, 4 or 5 years later, when the supermarkets had full control, we had the $1 a milk, $1 a litre, and that was the end of farmers. And now we're a net importer of milk. We're a net importer because we've lost so many dairy farmers to the perverse incentives that the market places on them. We know that cheap fossil fuels is over. The era of cheap fossil fuels is over. We know Scope 3 emissions is coming in for all the ASX listed companies in January 30 next year. And then by July 31 next year will be all companies above 100 million in revenue. And as someone spoke earlier, this is going to flow through to everyone. So everyone's going to be scrambling for you as the farmer to justify. So that gives you a certain amount of power. So we should see a certain flipping in the power. And as a lot of speakers have said today, and because of Farmers Regen Mutual, this is putting the power back into farmers' hands and empowering the farmer to say, no, we can actually choose and think more carefully about who we sell our carbon credits to, or our ecosystem services, or our biodiversity credits, or whatever else. So that's changing. And certainly in the area that I'm in social enterprise and impact investing, with the Impact Investment Summit earlier this year, where it's grown so much because all that investment community is seeing the modelling and is saying, we want to invest in businesses that don't rely on those long supply chains, that aren't going to be at risk so much to geopolitical shocks. So supermarkets are very vulnerable because their business model is based on that. Their business model is based on very cheap, highly processed foods coming from a long, long way away, and most of it is frozen. So it's really putting them under a lot of risk to have relationships with farmers.
Rob, there's one other element to that I heard today, and that is the incredible complexity of these carbon markets that you're talking about and the processes of certification, even before we get to the acronyms. The issue, if you need capacity, credibility and capital, and that seems to favour larger market entrants, how do you scale farmers? How do you get aggregation that still allows the independence of the ownership, that still derives the benefit back to the farm, to the farmer, to the consumer? And this is the conversation back to ownership and who is controlling that supply chain. That's so important. And it is, a huge shout out to Farmers Regen Mutual. It is so important to have diversity of business models in markets like carbon trading, carbon markets, because otherwise those markets will be dominated by certain types of aggregate models, which tend to favour, larger entities. This is a chance to get competition in there and price signals that actually favour different owners of that supply chain.
Yeah. There was a question earlier today about how do we aggregate those transaction costs so that the transaction costs aren't as high when they're looking at the innovators, the real innovators. And the fella from AFI, whatever his name is, Mr. Heath, he was a principal of the nearby school when I went to school in Western Victoria, so I call him Mr. Heath. But 20 years we were telling him the food system was broken. It's only now that he gets told by AI that it's broken. So, a history lesson is the innovators are the social enterprises, and these farmers, the biodynamic, the organic, the regen farmers from a long time ago, they've been demonstrating this model. So we've got to sort of really look at how do we acknowledge them, because acknowledgement is really important. Those pioneers, those heroes that were ostracised 20, 30, 40 years ago. They were amazing individuals who went out and said, I'm going to do this without chemicals. And I'm going to talk about like P.A. Yeomans in the 1930s, was doing this. So the same in the social enterprise space. And now we're seeing philanthropists who are, well, in the case of the Food Connect Shed, we've now got I don't know what you call it, a financial instrument called equity philanthropy. So they've invested $200,000 in the Food Connect Shed. It sits on their balance sheet as they're a part owner. The share price goes up every year. At the moment, it's going up every year. But they never receive an equity from it. They never want to see a dividend for it because they want to see what we're doing thrive and those sort of things there. The same with farmers. If you want to take the pressure off your farm, as Melina was saying, as a mutual, you don't have to be an organised mutual to do this. If you've got biodiversity credits or carbon trading money, invest that in the local butcher, invest that in other businesses. So you've got a revenue stream that's coming from those various businesses. So when the next drought hits, which is inevitable, the next flood, all of these things that are coming down the turnpike from the 6 planetary overshoots that we're looking at the moment, you've got other forms of income. That's one of the failures, and I'm going to be a provocateur here, one of the failures of the early cooperative system that I was a part of in Colac, with Colac Dairying Company that invented Western Star butter. All of those cooperatives was they didn't look after their workers. The people at the factories weren't a member of the cooperative. The consumers weren't a member of the cooperative. So these days, if we're going to invent the mutual society or the cooperative, we need to engage with the customer. We need to engage with the truck driver. We need to engage with the value adder, the cheese maker. And I think there's a real opportunity for us in this current market to look at where can those diverse income streams go into to give us the resilience and our regions the resilience. As Rowan was talking about earlier, the integrity, the integrity of our food system is at risk if we don't look regionally and we don't, the biggest investor in the Food Connect Shed, he sat down with me and all he wanted to know was all about me and what I was up to and what I did in my community and thing like that. He obviously read the prospectus. He was very impressed with the prospectus, but it was a huge risky venture. And we raised, $2.5 million or now $3 million now in pretty much all of equity, a couple of $100,000 in debt, a couple of $100,000 in convertible debt, and then a couple of $100,000 in this new, what we call philanthropy equity. And now we've got farmers and in that 540 group, we've now got, there's about 20 farmers who are invested in the shed. And in 7 or 8 years, well, we're now 5 years in 2 or 3 years, they'll start receiving a dividend from the shed. So that sort of thing will help them if we can get more of these community owned. So there's no banks involved in the Food Connect Shed. Not a single bank is involved, apart from Bank Australia, who are our bank, our trading bank. And I always talk about
it's community capital.
Yeah, and this is
capital that's raised
together
by pooling your resources.
Yeah. And I talk about I was just going to just quickly mention that the Food Connect Shed relies on this model around the head, heart, hands, and we have the same thing with money. There's head money, there's heart money, and there's hands money. And hands money is obviously on your P&L. That's the money you earn from selling grain or selling meat. The head money is your debt or equity. So that's the money that sits on your balance sheet. And then there's the heart money that is now sitting out there because all of these huge wealthy families, the money is now passed to the next generation who are really concerned about climate change, really concerned about biodiversity loss, really concerned about population health, these sort of things here. And they're now giving that money or in terms of, they call it philanthropy, venture philanthropy, where they'll put philanthropic money into something rather for 5 years, and then it'll be tied to revenue after that. We've got philanthropists now that are doing 100%. So instead of 95% of their corpus investing in the regular market, the whole 100% of their corpus is investing in impact. And we've got the Impact Club, another group of young, mainly women. So that's heart money. So we need to step out there and start to ask for that heart money if we're in the space of really genuinely providing the future planet that we all that we all sort of, and the future communities that we strive to exist in.
Just on capital, Rob,
Mm.
co-ops can get head capital, if you want to call it that. They can get equity, they can get debt from commercial partners. The important thing is it doesn't interfere with the control of the decisions about the purpose of the business. And keeping that purpose, I mean, my final provocation is, whose side are we on in the market? And if the market is carbon and decarbonising the planet, whose side? This is a market. We've heard this in the previous session, the complexity of it, the need to scale and aggregate scale, interact with markets. You know, cost of capital is really pushing some of the good outcomes that we need to decarbonise, but whose side are we on in this market, and how can we put that stakeholder at the centre of the market, invert the model? And in this case, that, you know, talking about Farmers Regen Mutual, the farmer is at the top of that pyramid. The primary producer is the primary beneficiary, and it's working in their interests.
Yeah. So when Carmel Onion was there speaking earlier, I thought he was going to ask, but he didn't. I thought he was going to say, why are we bearing the cost? You know, they still want their cash flow. They still want you to pay the interest. Yet the Commonwealth Bank and all of those industries should be paying you, the farmer, to do all of that work, to provide that service for them, because they're the ones who have got the KPIs. The farmers haven't got the KPIs around this. They've got the KPIs. So we need to, flip it. And we've always seen ourselves, particularly dairy farmers, we've always seen ourselves as the bottom of the pecking order. But I think farmers need to sort of see yourself now as, particularly the smaller farmers, and this is going to be, because the final frontier for humanity is to get along. And at the moment, the only reason why large corporates and large farms can attract this money at the moment is because we don't know how to aggregate, we don't know how to collaborate, we don't know how to run collectives, run cooperatives and mutuals. There's no institution, there's no teaching institution in Australia that teaches cooperativism. So the smaller farmers to aggregate is going to be demonstrating the model around how do we collaborate, how do we work together to reduce those transaction costs and provide impact, Matt, that an investor or a philanthropist or anyone could look at and say, look at all these benefits, core benefits, is Rowan's still here, look at all these core benefits that have been provided. And that service to community in terms of that, doing that work, doing the hard work, getting along, is going to be
trust
critical.
Networks.
Yeah, building those high trust networks.
It's team up to clean up.
Yes, I like that.
Thanks.
Thanks, mate. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Melina. Thank you, Rob. That was fantastic. A bit of power, a bit of market power to finish up with. The last session of today, I've been waiting, well, I think we've all been waiting for this session by virtue of the fact that it's at the end, but I've been particularly excited about this session. We've got two farmers here who can answer the question, where are farmers in all this, better than any other farmers in Australia. Rob Mackenzie and Billy Jones, both exceptional farmers, both doing things very differently. Who have I asked to be the provocateur and who have I asked to be the responder? Did I throw that out the window or you threw that out the window? One or the other. I'll just do a quick introduction. Macca has recently appeared on Landline twice in one edition and he didn't die. I mean, that's amazing. I used to say if you got in the land twice, once it was for your notice and the other one was for, pardon? No slides, but I think, Macca, did you want your video played? Or are you happy with that? Yeah, we might play it at the end. Okay, I'm going to pass over. We'll hear from the farm.
Thanks, Wardy.
We are the lucky last. Full clarification, I am not a farmer. I'm an accountant by trade. I'm the business manager for a farm in northern Tasmania. Loved your presentation, Claire. Excel spreadsheets will change the world. Pay your accountants and lawyers what they're worth. So we've been asked to do a presentation on where the farmer is in the carbon trading space. Can I just have a show of hands? Who here has land and would class themselves as a producer?
That's a few.
That it is actually more than what I thought. When you
Bit
look,
more pressure, isn't it now?
so much pressure. When I looked at the program for today, it's interesting that it's talking about carbon trading, so very much agricultural focused, and so much of the presentations are about markets and academics and advisors, and not so much how do we do this? What does that look like? So we'll try and bring it back to that. I guess my point is, where's the farmer in this? Where's the carbon in the farming enterprise? What does that look like? How do we do it? And why do we do it? So, as I said, I'm an accountant. I'm a business manager. We do have carbon projects on the farm that I work for, but in terms of being out every day, working with the livestock, looking at the pastures, I've got to defer to Macca. So what does your farm look like? What did it look like before you got into the carbon space? And were you deficient in terms of pasture mass at the time when you started the process?
Yeah, look, that's a good question. So firstly, Robert Mackenzie, I'm a 4th generation beef producer in our family, located on the east coast of New South Wales, so Hunter Valley, Gloucester, Port Stephens area. We run about 3,500 commercial breeders with a seed stock operation that supports that. Over 8 properties, about 16,000 acres. But look, that's a good question. When we decided to step into that space, I think it was mainly driven around the MLA in 2017, when they said we'll work towards becoming carbon neutral by 2030. And how does that look? How does that look for us? I suppose having my 2 boys in the operation, 2 that are obviously younger, that want to be more involved in sustainable agriculture, it was quite easy for us to step into that space. So we dug into our soil. We learned what was going on in our soil. And that was where the point was. It was 2017, so it wasn't much after the drought. But we did have grass cover because we think that we were doing a lot of the right things anyway to work towards becoming that sustainable agriculture.
So you weren't intentionally targeting a low baseline?
No, we didn't measure when we should have. Maybe that's because we weren't advised correctly.
How much did you know about carbon sequestration before you decided this was something you wanted to pursue?
Well, look, we looked into it like a lot of people looked into it, tried to understand it. And like I said, when the MLA said, hey, we're going to become carbon neutral, I think we were like everyone else. What does it mean? It's probably bullshit. But we didn't know a lot about it. So we then decided to get some outside advice, and we spoke to a few companies that came to offer their services and wanted to lead us down a certain path. And from that point, we decided, well, look, I think we can do it ourselves. We can manage this. We can manage our own credits. We can work with key people and pay them a fee, and we'll manage our future. And that's what we decided to do.
So is carbon an enterprise in itself, or is it an outcome of being a good producer?
Well, and look, I can only speak from our experience, from what our path that we chose. I think it's from being a good producer that wanted to do it different, but saw the benefits. I don't believe that anyone should pay us to become carbon neutral. I think there's so many more positives in us becoming carbon neutral, sustainable, whatever you want to call it. So it's not pity me. It's not, oh, who's going to pay us or help us? And we did it on our own. We dug deep and we become carbon neutral.
So describe that process. You take your baseline. What happens?
Yeah, well, look, and that's good. Describe that. And don't get me wrong. This was a lot of hard work, and it was a lot of, talking to people and understanding and get those right people around us. A right team, you can achieve anything, and that's what we had. We had the right people on the ground, but we had the right people supporting us and advising us. Everything from, a local rural store, Seed Force, our agronomists, our advisors, and just our team become passionate because it became addictive, because we could see the benefits, we could see the results in our soil samples, and it was just great as a team to know that we're on a great trajectory to do something great for us, for our industry, but also for Australia.
So it's a multi-year process to achieve carbon credits.
Yeah, look, we probably really got into it just after the drought, that 2019, 2020. And that was probably another reason we learned, for every extra gram of carbon we store in the soil, it's 8 grams of water. For every 1% carbon gain in our soil per hectare, it's 160,000 litres of water. It wasn't going to make us drought proof, but what it was going to do was going to make us more, I suppose, produce more feed when it comes dry. So we've got feed growing in those dry times. So yeah, it was quite a few years to get that, a lot of pasture improvement, a lot of work and a lot of things to do to get to that. So it probably about a 4-year process, putting a lot of effort into it.
I don't know if you've noticed in the carbon space, there's a lot of opinions, great deal of advice, most of it free and unsolicited. What was your experience?
Oh, look, I'm not one to take advice, negative advice. I often tell people that I've never ever looked at, and we have a few businesses, but I never look at anyone else's website. I never worry about what anyone else is doing, because then I'll go off track for what I know is the right thing to do. I think, look, we established back in 1884 by my great aunties, and I think that's great. 2 aunties raised my grandfather, passed it down to my father, down to me, and obviously we've grown the business and I have my 2 boys. So we look back, there was a lot of things that they did and a lot of things my father did that were the right things, the right way to farm. So all we had to do was tweak those things, just do it a little bit different, understand it a bit better. And you know what? There's so many farmers out there that are doing it right. But our biggest problem? We don't tell the story. We don't share what we do on social media. We don't tag the right people in. We do not let the good story out. And the other thing we don't do, we don't share the good stories with each other. We don't help each other out, because we're worried that someone else will capture that data and they'll use it. But what you got to look at, the more that we share, the more we tell, the stronger we make Australia, the more that our product's worth on the open market. So share the good times, share the stories. And if you find something that works well, tell your neighbour.
I did warn him before we did this presentation about data and details. So
Yes, you did.
Changes that you had to make, what were they? Be very specific.
Yeah, righto. Okay. Look, we realised multiple grass species work well together. Okay, so that's what we really focused on. We worked out what worked well in our area. And that was everything to do with if it's facing south or east, we'll plant a different species there. But we worked out grass species that worked really well. And if you watch Landline on iView, you'll be able to see what those grass species are. But we also increased the stock rotation from paddock to paddock, capturing data a lot better so we understand what was going on, even to the point we've broken our farms up into weather zones. So 4 weather zones on each farm. So we know exactly what area is getting the most moisture or most rain certain times of the year. That helps us plant the pasture. But multiple grass species, aeration, stock rotation, and organic fertilizer when we can, but we still use synthetic fertilizer, but we use less of that. But also trying to cut our costs. So everything from, every one of our farms, we topographical mapped it, we soil profile, LiDAR, the soil profile, 1,400 soil samples this year, 1,200 last year, and it is a lot. It's to understand our soil. It's to understand what's going in. So when we spread lime, urea, fertilizer, whatever it is, organic fertilizer, we'll USB stick into the side of the spreader truck, and then we'll just variable rate spread. So less inputs to do the work too.
Sell carbon credits, retain, be carbon positive for your product?
Yeah, look, so we worked out what our carbon footprint was. We developed a baseline. We did an audit. We sent that away to get that double checked, because obviously if you have an event on the 22nd of May, we had a lot of industry leaders come to our place, and it was on Landline. It was a great story. They told a great story. So we've decided at the moment that we'll keep our carbon credits. That's not to say that we won't share them with our customers. We won't sell on the spot, but at the moment, so we are carbon neutral at the gate. We're not carbon neutral on the plate. Will we be carbon neutral on the plate? Yeah, because we've put other processes in place to lessen our carbon footprint. No animal walks more than 1.2 kilometres to get a drink of water, so those animals are more productive. We purchased a bull the other day, and people say, why do you pay so much for that bull? Because that bull, Thunderstruck, you can Google him, that bull with our other genetics will help us make a more sustainable animal, an animal that is more productive, an animal that is more fertile, shorter gestation period, weight gain. So that's our focus. We're from here, focusing on those things, hold our carbon credits, share them with our customers, because we're a box beef program all over the world. And we want to develop a true product from paddock all the way to the plate that is carbon neutral.
Didn't actually send this question to you in advance, but data management.
Yeah, well, look, that's really good. So, and I've heard a lot of that. So we work closely with AgLive and together, and also Hayden Hollis from AgriCore. So we actually, all of our farms are broken down into each farm, every paddock. So how many hectares are in that paddock? But also we captured live data by videos from those weather stations. But also if we move cattle into that paddock, we'll document that just on the mobile phone in that paddock. If we do any work in that paddock, we put out lick blocks, whatever we do, aeration, mulching, whatever, we capture all that data, and then the product comes with a QR code. So all that data can be loaded into that smart label. And when it receives, the Hyatt in Singapore or Abu Dhabi or Dubai, they can scan that and see the story about that product and about what we do. So data capture is very important for our operation. It's not about us. It's about telling the story how good Australia is. And that's what we like to do. We like to, obviously it's about us too, but it's about telling the story about Australian agriculture. And that's what we like to do through these smart labels.
What's the future?
To create a sustainable animal. That's otherwise Karma will be chasing me down for how much I spent the other day.
So purpose built then?
Yeah, just purpose-built animal, but just obviously make our operation more sustainable. And obviously you can only keep sequestering so much carbon for a certain period of time. So it's important that we keep focusing on lessening our carbon footprint so we're more sustainable for the future. What is the future? The future is creating a sustainable operation for the next generation.
I guess a lot of the topics that have been talked about today, when I walk into my office tomorrow, it's not going to be immediately practically relevant. A lot of what gets talked about, by the time it gets to me and impacting what I do every day, it'll be a bolt on to a cloud computing program. It'll be part of legislation. It will be a standard in some kind of quality program that we've subscribed to. Does that reflect what you're trying to do?
It probably should be more of what we're trying to do. Yes. There's only so many hours in the day and my days run out very quick. But yeah, we need to be capturing more of that data and more of that going on for sure. Definitely. So if you're looking for a job and you want to move from Tasmania where it's pretty cold.
No colder than Sydney today, I'd like to say.
Yeah.
Excellent. Thanks so much.
That's it. Thanks. I'd like to thank everyone for today. I think it was not easy to find the time to drive to Sydney at 4:30 this morning, but it was good. I thought it was a great event. It was great seeing the monkeys and yeah, I took a selfie with the monkeys, but anyway. But look, if you have any questions, feel free to send me an email or track us down. I'm on LinkedIn or I'm on Instagram, where I'm here today to tell our story in a way that might just inspire other people that it is achievable, it is doable, and it is beneficial. I don't know whether I got this bit, but the benefits for us is more water retention, healthier pasture, healthier soil, healthier animals. Our conception rate is sitting at about 96%, so that's pretty high. But also happy customers, and also we're proud of what we're doing. So it's a win-win for everyone. So thanks.
All right.
Thanks, Billy. You're great.
Thank you, Billy. I'm not letting you get away that easy. We still have 3 more minutes, and Billy is the business manager of the farm that has the only enhancing remnant vegetation and carbon plus biodiversity projects running concurrently in Australia. So my question for you is, what encouraged you to get into that process?
Okay. Should clarify, I'm not the owners of the property, but the property was always purchased with the intention to support, enhance the natural values of the property, whatever that may be. So there was always intention to undertake revegetation activities on the property. We were in a fortunate situation that obviously I was on board, so contracts, compliance, acquittals, data, love that. We were also fortunate to have an ex-forester working on the farm in a compliance and forestry role. So we had a great deal of IP on the property that meant when it came to things like GIS recording of data, species management and selection for trees, landscape values, we had that knowledge on hand already. And when grant programs, government or not-for-profit, as the case may be, came up, we were able to utilise plans that we had to further our own strategic goals in partnership with programs to help offset those costs that wouldn't conflict with those goals. So we're very fortunate in that sense.
Thank you, Billy. Thank you, Mac. I really appreciate both of your time today. Thank you. I'd like to ask Helen if she would come down. We're about to do a wrap, but I have asked Helen McCosker from Carbonate to just give a farmer's impression of what we've learned today, what some of the takeaway lessons from her were. I won't keep you much longer, and I promise there is a beer at the end of this. And so without much further ado, I'm going to hand over to Helen.
Thanks, Wardy. It's really funny. I arrived a bit late this morning and Wardy had said, oh, do you want to introduce some speakers? And I said, yeah, that's great. Who do you want me to introduce? And then he said, I'll come back to you. And then at lunchtime, I said, who do you want me to introduce? And so now he's like, do you want to just do the wrap up? And I'm like, okay. So I'm supposed to do the wrap up, but I would just like to say to Wardy and Rowan and all the team, amazing. Like, I think that what you've been able to present and pull together in such a short space of time, and to get the extra, like even to have producers here and farmers here is like really next level. I think that I've been to a lot of, yeah, thank you. Yeah, give them a round of applause. Thank you. I'd also like to thank, I was just about to say, I've been to quite a few carbon conferences, and I think that a lot of you have, where there's actually not many farmers in the room. So it was really, really fantastic to see so many farmers come along today. I think it's made a big difference. And I think that it really shows the strength of the Regen Farmers Mutual and everything that they're doing. So good on you guys. So in terms of wrap up, what was the best statement of the day? Yeah, self-licking ice cream. We've got to put that front and center of the social media. So yeah, I think that was probably my favorite statement. Was there any standouts for anybody in terms of the speakers or anything you've learnt? Everyone was great. Yeah, I agree. It was fantastic. So if I can just give a bit of an update of what Carbonate's doing. So we're actually a charity. We're not a carbon aggregator. And we actually empower farmers to grow carbon and grow biodiversity. So we're a bit different in the marketplace, and we're really excited about what we're doing in the market. We have what we call a community of practice, and we encourage farmers to come online and really support farmers on this journey of regenerative agriculture. So if anyone's interested in being on an online supportive environment with other farmers, please, we've got some forms out the back that you can come and be, and we've got our green shirt people, our green shirt team, and Mike McCosker, who has actually so my husband, Mike, we live on a 3,000 acre farm in northern New South Wales. We've been doing this regen farming for quite a long time. So if you've got any questions or anything that you need to know, you can talk to our team. Again, Wardy, I've got to say that Wardy's dad, Bruce Ward, was actually, that's where Mike lives, at Wallingra. And so I think one of the field days that Bruce put on was actually at Blaney at Wallingra. So it's just a really, I want to honour Bruce for all of the beautiful work that he's done that has brought us together here, because he was a real champion of and an amazing man. So yeah, thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay. Well, Helen kind of mentioned my late father, Bruce Ward, and I was lucky to be in the room a few times. So I was lucky to be in the room in 1993 when he and my godfather decided to become holistic management educators. And I was lucky enough to be in the room in 2008 when they decided to set up Sustainable Land Management, which became one of the big corporate aggregators around Cunnamulla and attracted international investors into their business. And I was lucky to be in the room with Rowan when we created Incubator Co-op that really fueled my interest in giving stakeholders a stake and gave that some structure. And I was lucky to be in the room when the farmers decided to co-design what was then protected Habitat Farmers Mutual. And I was lucky to be in the room when they offered me a job if I found myself a salary or a way to pay for myself. And I feel equally that I'm lucky to be in the room today, because what I think we've kind of done with our first in-person gathering of our members, and sure, it's not just been members, we've brought in people that can add traditionally a lot more value to farmers than just farmers talking around themselves. And I think we kind of created a bit of a lighthouse for ourselves today. And I was thinking about, lighthouses are good because they tell you where land is, and we're all about management of the land as farmers. And lighthouses are good because they help you avoid running into rocks. And I guess today is a pretty special day, but it certainly wouldn't have happened without our members committee of our steering committee who have met with Rowan and I every fortnight without fail since 2020 and guided us through how to run the mutual for the benefit of members. We would have been able to put on today without Rowan, without our wonderful volunteers, Dave Wall, Lily Rogers, wonderful Taronga Conservation Society, the support of the fellows in Carbonate. Our secret sauce, though, was our speakers. So if I could, a collective round of applause or cheers or whoop for our speakers. They just did such an amazing job. And last but not least, I'd like to personally thank my family, my mum and brother out in Dubbo, but also Sally and the kids who've helped me through registration and preparation for today. Last thing I'd like to say is we are about to take what we've learned today and put that into some proposals for our members' general meeting. That won't be held in this room. In fact, we need to go up and to the right. If you're part of the members' general meeting, we've got a boardroom that we can utilise starting from 6 p.m. We'll try and make it short and sweet so that we can join whoever else is interested in going to a pub for a beer and a steak tonight. I think the nearest pub is the Bona Vista. If you follow Bradley's Head Road, it comes to a T intersection. It'll be right there on your right. So if anybody's interested, is wanting to discuss the day and isn't a member, may I suggest the Bona Vista. And if you are a member, stick around. We've got half an hour to kick around, and then we're going to start the members' general meeting. Ron, before I close out, is there anything you'd like to say? All right. Thank you, everybody.